Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the inquiry into the impact of regulatory framework for cannabis in New South Wales and further public hearings. This is the fourth hearing of the committee's inquiry into the impact of regulatory framework for cannabis in New South Wales. Firstly, I would like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, the traditional custodians on the lands on which we are meeting today. I pay my respects to elders past and present and celebrate the diversity of Aboriginal peoples and their ongoing cultures and connections to the lands and waters of New South Wales. I also acknowledge and pay my respects to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining us today. My name is Jeremy Buckingham and I am the chair of this committee. I ask everyone in the room to please turn their mobile phones to silent. Parliamentary privilege applies to witnesses in relation to the evidence they give today. However, it does not apply to what witnesses say outside of the hearing. I urge witnesses to be careful about making comments to the media or to others after completing their evidence. In addition, the Legislative Council has adopted rules to provide procedural fairness for inquiry participants. I encourage committee members and witnesses to be mindful of these procedures. To the witnesses, welcome and thank you very much for making the time to give evidence, especially at the end of the year and a busy time. Could each witness, starting from my left, please state their name and position title and swear either an oath or affirmation. So I'll start with you, Commissioner.
Thank you, Chair. My name is Michael Allen Barnes. I'm the Commissioner of the New South Wales Crime Commission. I solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth.
Thank you very much, Commissioner. Mr. Bennett.
Yeah, my name is Darren Bennett. I'm the Executive Director of Operations at the New South Wales Crime Commission, and I solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth.
Thank you very much. Do either of you or the Commission have any introductory remarks you'd like to make?
I would like to make a few remarks, Chair.
Thank you very much, Commissioner.
I'd like to thank you and the committee for inviting Mr. Bennett and I to address you this morning. We're happy to provide any assistance that we are able to. I should note, though, that the terms of reference of this inquiry extend far beyond the jurisdiction of the Crime Commission, which focuses on preventing, disrupting and reducing serious and organised crime and confiscating the proceeds of crime. Accordingly, we should focus only on term of reference 1D and in particular the impact of the current regulatory framework on crime. We won't be submitting or making any suggestions in relation to the socio-economic impact or health impacts of the current regulatory regime or the effects of any relaxation of restrictions that will increase the use of marijuana. Cannabis is by far the most consumed illicit substance. It's estimated that about 14 tonnes are consumed annually with a street value of approximately $340 million. A significant proportion of that total is produced by people who either consume it all themselves or distribute it in a small way to friends and associates. Another significant amount of the total produced each year is grown and distributed by small-time commercial operators. However, the remainder, which is very significant in volume, is produced by serious organised crime figures and distributed by organised crime networks. It's impossible to accurately apportion the total between those three categories of growers distributors. However, we can say with certainty that serious organised crime produces huge amounts of marijuana that are sold for tens if not hundreds of millions of dollars each year. We can also say that last year 120 people were charged with produced commercial quantity or large commercial quantity, which involved 250 and 1,000 plants respectively. In one case, a single organised crime network was charged with producing 15,000 plants with an estimated street value of $53 million. Mr. Bennett can provide further details in relation to those operations if you wish. These operatives are responsible for significant harm. They engage in extreme violence to maintain the security of their production facilities and their market share. They launder their profits using professional money launderers, avoiding tax and other financial regulations. They abuse migrant worker schemes and the workers themselves. They occupy productive farmland that could otherwise be used for food production. Their profits distort the economy by competing unfairly with the lawful producers of other products. Now, those brief observations might lead some to suggest that the current regulatory framework is not working. With respect, I don't accept that, although it's true that no criminal law results in complete cessation of the prescribed conduct. The prosecutions and proceeds applications that we initiate demonstrate that the law is being enforced against high-level traffickers whenever possible. Further, with respect, there's no basis to assume that legalising cannabis would lead to the eradication of these industrial-scale producers who are our primary concern. For example, tobacco has been legally produced and sold in Australia since the British arrived, but the involvement of organised crime in its distribution and the extreme violence they engage in to extend their control of different sectors of the market continues to increase, as we see in the news media almost weekly. There's no reason to think that trafficking of marijuana would follow any different course. That's all I wish to say at this stage. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Commissioner. Well, I'll turn to questions from the government members.
Thanks, Chair, and thanks, Mr Barnes and Mr Bennett, for coming along. Just on that last point, firstly, Mr Barnes, you talked about the tobacco, illegal tobacco industry. Is that something, and that's obviously an interesting counterpoint and analogy, I think, when thinking about cannabis issues. Is that something in terms of the illicit tobacco market that has changed over the years and perhaps has changed in relation to the price of legal tobacco?
Mr Bennett's probably better placed to answer that question.
Yeah, that's definitely the case. So the price point's gone up and up due to regulatory costs and tax, and that's led to a thriving black market that's operating both in terms of illegally imported cigarettes and basically homemade cigarettes. And we've all seen in recent times the competition for both territory and markets in Victoria and to a lesser extent in New South Wales. It's clearly being controlled by criminal networks, and they're using violence and essentially burning each other out to establish those markets. At the back of that is illicitly produced and sold tobacco products and vapes that are being sold through legitimate tobacconists.
I'm not sure exactly when the price point of tobacco significantly accelerated to the point where a black market is encouraged and expands. But if you go back, say, 3 decades or so, when, I can't remember the exact price, but you could pick up a packet of 20s for like $1 or something.
$1.10. Yeah,
$1.10. At that point, would there have been a big illegal tobacco market?
No, not that I'd be aware of. I think the price point's reached a point now where a lot of people can't afford to smoke legally. And I think that's the difference. I saw a graph recently, I can't remember where we are, but we're like the second most expensive in the world for legal tobacco products. And you can still get a packet for $1 in a lot of Southeast Asian countries. So that's certainly a driver of what's going on. There's no doubt about that.
It seems, on my understanding, that the policy rationale for continually increasing the taxation on tobacco is a health one, but it seems, even though it's not the intention, it seems to have a direct relationship with the creation of a black market. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, look, I assume it is a health related initiative, but you know, the contact I've had with police in California as well, with their legalisation of cannabis over there, it's a similar theme. There's still a thriving black market because the compliance and regulatory costs of selling it legally are so high, and the fact that possession's no longer an offence means there's more and more users, and so the black market's actually bigger now, according to the police I speak to, than it was before it was legalised. So it's a similar theme.
So just going back to Mr Barnes and your comment, Mr Barnes, about if there was, I'm not sure if you said if there was decriminalisation or legalisation, you wouldn't necessarily expect to see a decrease in the organised crime involvement. Just going back to that comment that I think you made, is that depending on the regulatory system that accompanies legalisation or decriminalisation, and the price point, I suppose, that cannabis is set at? Would that largely?
I think that would have a lot to do with it. I can't envisage government setting up a regime where they undercut the price of tobacco cigarettes by marijuana cigarettes. That would be a strange outcome. But were that the case, if they were sufficiently cheap, there would be less reason to resort to illegal supplies.
Can I just ask a question there, if you don't mind me interrupting? Has the Commission seen an increase in people cultivating tobacco as the price point has gone up and demand has remained? Has that emerged as as an issue, an increase in like domestic production in actual fact of tobacco in terms of cultivation?
Well, that's Commonwealth offending. It's not something we focus on in terms of our day-to-day business. I'm not aware of an increase or a decrease in cultivation. I'm aware of cultivation in some parts of New South Wales, but it's not something we focus on. It's an AFP border force.
And the vast majority of illegal tobacco is imported rather than grown locally.
Yeah.
Sorry, Mr. Lawrence.
No problem at all. Just going back to the comment that you made, Mr. Bennett, about some international police counterparts of yours talking about an increase in use that is brought about as a consequence of law reform. Do you recall if that was decriminalisation in those jurisdictions or full-scale legalisation that they thought had led to the increase in use?
No, I'm not sure. I tend to think it's legalisation, and a mayor from Portland spoke at the Drug Summit last week about this as well, about the exponential increase in users when they decriminalised in Oregon as well, and how it emaciated the authority of the police around the place, and they couldn't really control where the drugs were being used, though libraries, schools, places like that. And then the police essentially just give up on enforcement because they're overwhelmed. So that's a similar theme to what I've spoke to from police overseas.
Yeah, because we took evidence earlier in the inquiry from the Royal College of Psychiatrists, who provided us with a summary of research which basically suggested that internationally decriminalisation has not led to an increase in use, whereas legalisation has. That was basically the summary of what they said to us. Just going back to Mr. Barnes then, I think you said earlier that you wouldn't expect that if there was a legal market that the price point would be lower than cigarettes.
Yes.
Was that a comment based on health issues as you would perceive it, in terms of weight that the legislature and the executive might put on health issues?
I would hope so. I mean, as I said, we're not equipped to give you evidence about the health impacts of marijuana use, but I'm sure you've heard from people that have told you it's at least as dangerous as tobacco when it comes to health impacts.
Yeah, I think the evidence that we've had is to the effect that it depends on how it's consumed. If it's smoked, then it's carcinogenic, but in other forms, it's not so. So if we were to consider a recommendation that legalisation should be considered, would you be of the view that any such scheme should be tailored to not leave a role for organised crime in cultivation and distribution?
That's our sole focus.
Yeah.
We are concerned of any change of the laws if it makes it easier for organised crime to produce and distribute the product.
And apart from the price point, if we can put it that way, is there other factors that you see that would relate to that question of whether a black market would continue to exist?
Well, obviously selling it to children's one.
Yeah.
A clear and obvious one. Price point's another. Availability is another. Ready availability is another.
Yeah.
And established markets that exist now.
Yeah.
Why would they change?
Yeah. To your knowledge, is there a black market in the production and distribution of alcohol in New South Wales?
No, I mean I've never seen any intelligence to suggest there is.
Not large-scale commercial. There's individual ethnic groups who, understandably and appropriately, like to indulge. But I'm not aware of any commercial operations.
Yeah. So why do you think that is? If you compare it to tobacco, for example, why do you think that there's not a black market in alcohol? Is that just a price point issue, or is there some other?
I'm not sure, sir. I've never given it a lot of thought, I'm sorry.
Yeah. Just a question then about the role of cannabis in existing crime networks and organised crime. Are you able, on the basis of your intelligence and knowledge that you're able to share, are you able to inform us about the role of cannabis in fueling other types of organised crime activity? I mean, I suppose it's logical that if a crime network is doing one criminal thing that's profitable, that they might then be investing in other areas or things of that nature.
Yeah, there's no brand loyalty in organised criminals. I'll go where a profit can be made.
Yep.
Mr. Bennett can probably give you more detail on that.
Look, we partner with the drug squad in the New South Wales Police Force. We've established a generic strike force over the course of a calendar year. This year it was called Herridale. Last year it was called Winifred Bites. And we partner in terms of intelligence and sourcing and identifying assets that we can seize on the back of police investigations. Those investigations relate solely to large commercial cannabis growing, usually in greenhouses in farms around Sydney and in rural areas. And there's the ones we investigate, they're highly specialised operations, usually transnational and serious organised criminals, mainly from Vietnam, and large-scale production and employing a lot of people and very sophisticated distribution. So I wouldn't say there's specific intelligence to say that they branch off into other types of drug sales, but I know from my previous experience, motorcycle gangs, other criminal groups, they'll sell anything if there's a buck in it.
Yeah. Are you able to give us a sense of how profitable that sort of large-scale cultivation is compared to, I don't know, other types of illicit drugs that are produced, whether methamphetamine or things like that?
We seized around $80 million worth of plants in the last year, charging 19 people. The setup costs wouldn't be cheap. The greenhouses and the equipment wouldn't be cheap, but it's clear and obvious that production of cannabis on a grand scale is very lucrative, especially with the high quality. Yeah. And they do take a risk because they're large undertakings that are out in the open. So there's a chance you're going to get caught. And so I would say the profit margins are extraordinarily high.
Yeah. And in terms of the migrant worker issue that you talked about, is this people that are assisting in the cultivation who are either here on visas or not here with visas? Is that the situation?
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Yeah, look, it's often what people say at the time they're sentenced that it forms the information base for it. So you can take it with a grain of salt, in my opinion. There seems to be a large proportion of people who didn't know what they were doing, but seemed highly skilled at doing it. So, and they say they're manipulated and taken advantage of. You know, my personal view is that that's probably not the case on a lot of occasions. That they full well know what they're doing. They certainly know how to operate farm machinery and very sophisticated hydroponic and indoor cultivation. So, you know, but they are usually on student visas or illegal immigrants.
Yeah. Okay.
So
And mainly from Vietnam.
Could I just ask just about the visa issue? So the visas that you're looking at are student visas, not your sort of other work visas.
No. Well, there'll be all types. Mainly they're illegally in Australia or on student visas. But I could get a breakdown of
That would be really helpful. Thank you.
Thank you. That's been taken on notice.
Yeah.
Mr. Murphy?
I just want to tease out one issue. You were saying that the reason for organised crime remaining a presence in the market is because of their large scale. Is that right? The economies of scale that they operate in. We heard evidence earlier on in the inquiry about jurisdictions overseas where they've set up cannabis cooperatives which could achieve a similar sort of scale of production where individuals sign up to a cooperative that's managed as a large-scale enterprise and then the medicinal cannabis is distributed to people. Is that something that you think could be used as a mechanism to displace organised crime? If we move to a model where there was that large-scale organised production that could effectively compete with the black market?
Yeah. Look, I don't think I can offer an opinion on that without knowing more about it.
Yeah, to usurp organised crime, you'd have to offer it at a cheaper cost and a a higher quality than a black market could produce, I think they're always going to beat you, to be honest.
Yeah. So the ACT has recently decriminalised effectively small possession and cultivation. I know that there remains a federal offence of possession that obviously applies through Australia, but I think somehow that's dealt with and that's not enforced effectively in the ACT. I'm just curious whether any intel or other information that you can share with us has flown through in terms of any impact on organised crime activity in New South Wales as a consequence of this island, I suppose, inside New South Wales of decriminalisation.
We're very grateful that ACT has agreed to pilot this brave program so the rest of us can watch.
Yeah.
We know that OMCG, outlaw motorcycle gangs that weren't previously ex ante in ACT have set up chapters there. You know more about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's happened. I don't know the broader effect of the legalisation in the ACT, though. I mean, it's a completely different environment than the rest of Australia, I would submit.
So in terms of OMCG, Mr. Barnes, you weren't suggesting that's as a consequence of decriminalisation, were you? Or
It could just be coincidental. I haven't interrogated the people who made that decision.
yeah, okay.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lawrence, and I'll now turn to questions from the opposition.
Thank you.
Mrs. McLaren-Jones.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you very much for coming today. I just wanted to start on the strike force that was reported, I think it was late last month. I think it was called Strike Force Herodale. I'm interested to know the trends around, I suppose, from that operation, maybe the last 5 or 10 years, in relation to cannabis supply possession. Have we seen a significant increase in the work you're doing and organised crime here in New South Wales particularly?
Well, look, we're not a policing agency, so we're a support agency for the police. We can certainly say that consumption seems to be increasing. I think 17% last year. The police are getting much better at detection and dismantling these organised criminal groups that are doing this, but the trend has been that the scale is getting bigger and bigger, and they're far more mobile.
And when you say you're a support agent, what role do you play, particularly in these strike forces and also the targeting organised crime?
So we focus on assets forfeiture, so we focus on the information that comes out of investigations that we can parlay into seizing assets from criminal groups, but we also provide an intelligence function as the investigation goes on, so we assist the police in that.
And in relation to organised crime, and you touched on this briefly, I'm interested to know, is that where is the higher use or distribution areas, whether it's regional, rural areas, metro, where are you finding those trends?
In terms of this operation, usually in rural areas in close proximity to Sydney,
yep,
or in the far northwest of the state.
The Victorian Parliament did a similar inquiry, and the police actually in one of their submissions stated that over the last 5 years, approximately 40% of cannabis use and possession offences occurred in conjunction with another offence. The top 4 co-occurring offences over that 5-year period were drug possession with another drug other than cannabis, receiving or handling stolen goods, weapons and explosive offences, drug trafficking and firearm offences. I'm wondering whether or not you have any research or any work's been done around that same correlation between cannabis supply and other crime activity.
Well, we focus on the serious organised crime aspect of it, yep, internally. It sounds to me like that data would be that most of their detections are a result of search warrants in relation to other matters.
Okay. You mentioned talking to counterparts in Canada. In
Canada, California, and other parts of the US. Yeah. I went to Vancouver a couple of years ago.
Yeah, and we're seeing sort of research coming out now where a number of those countries, the stats are going the opposite direction, is in the fact that it hasn't legalising or decriminalising marijuana hasn't necessarily reduced crime activity. Can you elaborate any further or any information or research you may have? in relation to that?
No, not with any great expertise. I went to Vancouver some time ago and spoke to the police there about, undercover operations, but in relation to this as well. And it's not a good story that they impart. But and you notice from being there that the significant shift in amenity of what the city's like compared to what it used to be like, because I've been there many times over the last 20 years. So it does make a significant change to both the authority of the police and the day-to-day amenity of the city. I've got no doubt about that.
And have they seen a change with organised crime as well?
Not that I can provide evidence on.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
I'm curious about whether you've seen changes in trends around the types of manufactured cannabis products that are available. There's been a lot of talk recently about nitazines coming into the market, and that they've either been associated with other like substance products, or they've been replacing those other products on the market. And I'm just wondering if there's any intelligence about how nitazines are entering the market and might be related to cannabis products.
Yeah, I think the police would probably be able to comment on that better than us. I don't have any specifics. The only trend I can report from our investigation is scale and scope is getting bigger and bigger, and the quality of the produced product is getting better and better.
Okay. So with the legalization of medicinal cannabis, has that changed the way that you are gathering intelligence or policing, or has that had any impact on your operations?
No.
Not at all? It doesn't...
Not from the Crime Commission's perspective.
Okay, so it doesn't make it more difficult, for example, to determine who is producing cannabis products legally or illegally onshore?
No, the legal production's heavily regulated.
Okay, so you've found that the relationship between regulators and yourselves is adequate?
Yeah, it's more with the police than with us, though.
Okay. All right, thank you.
Thank you very much. Do you have any more?
No.
The opposition. Thank you. In your introductory remarks, you talked about the nature of the illegal production, that there was essentially individuals producing it for themselves. There was significant small commercial operations, distribution, and then this other sector, which is the significant commercial operations that's relates to organised crime. Can you, of course, without going into operational matters, can you give us a nature, some indication of who the people are that are involved in this organised crime? What we traditionally it was regional growers involved with the mafia. Has that changed in the 1970s? Has that changed in more recent times? Who are the people that are growing these commercial? Is it purely domestic Australian organisations, or do they have links to other international organisations? Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, I don't. Look, there's still intelligence around the Italians and the like in the Riverina. There's still that intelligence comes in, but it's not in any way dominant like it used to be. OMCGs are certainly heavily involved in this, and also the trend of Vietnamese organised crime is ubiquitous through all of our investigations. So there's a niche there. There's still that far north coast growing operations in national parks and public places, but and there's also hydroponics in domestic houses. But every level of organised crime has a foothold in cannabis production and distribution.
But the main production and distribution, if I'm going off what you've said previously, is like large. It's moving to large,
Yep.
Greenhouses based in regional, rural, remote areas, as opposed to sort of opportunistic growing in public spaces or hydroponics, indoor hydroponic operations.
I would say that's the case, yes.
There's been some commentary that cannabis, illicit cannabis, is, to paraphrase, is a startup or the rocket fuel for some organised crime, i.e. that if you want to get involved in organised crime and you don't have, $200 million sitting under the bed, that it's a good way to get at that illegal business going. You can go out relatively cheaply and produce a large quantity of very valuable product. Is that something that you've seen, that this can be a progenitor of other crimes?
Yeah, I think so. I don't think it's as structured as that. I think cannabis cultivation and distribution is a industry of its own. I don't think it necessarily leads to anything else, but it might. It's just a cheaper drug to buy than MDMA, cocaine, and the other drugs that are prolific, and it's seen as a lot less harmful. So the market's enormous for it. As the Commissioner said, it's the most used illicit drug in the state.
And would you say that it's also cheaper and a lower risk to produce, i.e., importing meth from Burma or cocaine from Colombia?
I would say that. Yep.
You would say that?
On a small scale, yes.
On a small scale.
On a large scale, it's difficult. You need to be well resourced, and it's reasonably high risk, I would submit.
And is the involvement of the Vietnamese crime gangs a cultural issue, or is it because that they have the expertise to undertake the growing to the relatively the standard that the black market demands?
Yeah, I'm not 100% sure. It's been a niche in the Vietnamese community for quite some time. The large scale indoor hydroponics in southwestern Sydney were all Vietnamese based, and now we're finding that the large outdoor greenhouse operations are Vietnamese based as well. So who knows what the niche is there, but it's just a crime type. I don't know what sits behind it. I really don't.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Bennett. In your introductory remarks, Commissioner, you said that there was extreme violence associated with some of these operations. How does organised crime protect these operations? Because I'm sure they can't take out insurance, and how do they protect them? How do they ensure security and the like in terms of the production and the distribution?
They regularly have people with significant weaponry guarding the sites, and we've been involved in a number of murder investigations that are thought to be linked to marijuana distribution.
Okay. Thank you for that. And just on that point of the distribution, cannabis use in Australia and New South Wales is ubiquitous. The trend in terms of use has not gone down. It's been relatively steady for a long time, since the sort of 1960s or 70s, with sort of 16% of people regularly using cannabis. How important is that cannabis to the cash flow and to sustaining the actual network of distribution of other illicit drugs? Maybe I'm not being clear, but is cannabis a staple of drug distribution networks that ensures that they at least have something to sell some of the time, with then other drugs being also distributed and sold as well?
Well, Mr. Bennett might know more about this, but just anecdotally, I've been involved in a homicide investigation recently, and from a rural or regional city, and it was marked that the witnesses kept distinguishing between drug dealers who would supply cannabis and maybe one or other drug dealers who specialised in meth, and other drug dealers who dealt in heroin. And these witnesses all insisted, no, he wasn't part of that group, that there were three distinct groups operating in this regional town or city. But Mr. Bennett might give you more information.
No, I think cannabis cultivation and distribution is an industry of itself. I don't think it necessarily leads to other types of drugs being sold by the same people. There's certainly a lot of specialising in cannabis cultivation and distribution. The bulk of it, the need for distribution routes and a customer base, is the same as any other drug, and I think it's just as lucrative as selling anything else.
Thank you. You were referencing other jurisdictions overseas that had gone to to decriminalisation and legalisation. I think you mentioned Portland or Vancouver, and that may not have been enacted as people had initially intended. Do you think that the cannabis part of that issue is the biggest problem in those jurisdictions, or is it other drugs like opiates, fentanyl, or is cannabis use a big part of that? I think is that dysfunction.
Yeah, I mean, I was commenting on the contact I've had with the police overseas in the light of cannabis legalisation being a means by which to diminish the impact of organised crime in their society, and the overwhelming feedback is that it hasn't made really any difference at all.
And that's because of the regulatory burden of producing legal cannabis and the price point. That there's still an opportunity to come in.
Coupled with the fact there's now more users because it's decriminalised or legalised.
Is there? Do you know of any jurisdictions that are moving to repeal cannabis legalisation in Europe or the United States or Canada?
Not with any great expertise. Only I think Oregon is trying to wind it back. I'm not sufficiently briefed on that to give evidence about it though.
You have a question?
Yeah,
Steve?
just a few things.
I've got
Sure.
So there was discussion earlier about decriminalisation or legalisation potentially leading to an increase in use and therefore driving demand that then feeds organised crime activity. And I'm just interested to ask a few questions flowing on from that. Firstly, are you able to tell us what percentage of the market is in that category of small-scale cultivators who probably aren't your real concern?
No, I can't, I'm sorry. I mean, we've been the last few days preparing for this hearing, we've dug for those figures and we couldn't come upon anything sufficiently reliable to report to you, I'm sorry.
Yeah,
So-
we rely on the police data for that, and
Sure.
they would give that evidence.
Okay. So assuming that an increase in demand might drive organised crime more, do you think it might also be the case that a decriminalisation of small-scale cultivation might reduce the demand for cannabis that is cultivated by organised crime groups, on the basis that if there's more cannabis in the market that is cultivated by small local growers who distribute to friends and obviously use themselves, that might decrease the amount cultivated by organised crime?
It's hard to speculate. I mean, tomatoes can be freely grown, but most of us still buy them from commercial producers.
Yeah.
I'm not sure what the impact of making more amateur or small-scale producers of marijuana would have on the market generally.
Yeah, I suppose the analogy with tomatoes maybe fails in the sense that it would, in this scenario, still be an unlawful product.
Yeah.
So you're basically choosing where you get it from, but it'll be legal in that circumstance to cultivate very small amounts of it.
I think that's the position in Canberra, isn't it? There are a number of plants you can...
I think it's like 3 or 5 or 6 or something. Yeah, 4, is it 4? Yeah.
If you get into an arms race on quality, that's a slippery slope, especially if people are growing it domestically. It's really dangerous to grow cannabis in your house with hydroponics. So it's really dangerous. And so the problem with cannabis is that the quality goes up and up all the time. They're getting better at it all the time.
Yeah.
So.
In terms of the quality issue, so we've had evidence that 1 million medicinal scripts have been written since medicinal cannabis was legalised, I think in 2016. Are you able to tell us, and we've indeed been as part of this inquiry to a farm in northern New South Wales where they're growing it, and we're told that it's quite strong compared to what you might get in the illicit market sometimes, and that the price point is maybe a little bit higher than the illicit market, but still pretty manageable for people. Have you seen a decrease in the organised crime type cultivation of cannabis as a consequence of pretty widespread availability of medicinal cannabis?
No.
No, I don't think so. But, we're talking small numbers really. If you're talking a million scripts and we're talking about 120 people charged with commercial quantities,
Yeah.
you can see that it'd be difficult to show a connection.
Yeah. Assuming that there had been a decrease, is that something that would necessarily have come to your attention?
I don't think
through
it
your
would. I don't think that our volume is sufficient to pick that up, and I guess we're not sufficiently confident about the proportion of major operators that we're investigating and taking enforcement action against. We don't know what the whole number is, so we can't tell how successful or otherwise we're being.
Yeah. Now, you talked before about, apart from the price point, that if you were going to move to a legalised market, we were talking about the things that the regulatory framework might need to take into account to avoid a continued illicit market. And you talked about availability. So was that talking about availability in terms of geographically, like the service provision? Or was that also talking about, for example, whether it was done through chemists or done through a corner shop? Just wondering if you could expand on that a bit.
Well, I don't have any expertise in relation to that, but comparing the vapes situation, when vapes were available so widely, it seemed clear that there was a rapid increase in their usage, hence the move to limit them to chemists in future. I think the same would apply to marijuana.
Yeah. So the harder that it is to get under this sort of potential legalised market, the higher the chance that you'll continue to have a black market.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Lawrence. Mr. McLaren-Jones.
Just a couple of questions. One is, do you have a breakdown of, in relation to organised crime, the local versus international statistics? Because you did refer to a lot of it being Vietnamese, but just in the interest of you, do have that percentage breakdown?
No, we wouldn't have that. The police may.
Yeah. Okay. Also, in regards, you said it was rural and regional areas predominantly. Are you seeing an increase in organised crime moving into some more suburban areas?
I think the major pattern is that they establish the operation for a short period of time on a farm that they either rent or is owned through a series of a complex web,
Yeah.
and then they cultivate for a short space of time with the skill base they've developed, and then they dismantle it and move on. But there's 17, 18 greenhouses, large greenhouses in a lot of these things. They're really big operations, so I think that's the most common method at the moment now, is in and out as quickly as you possibly can, and then move on to the next place.
Which must make it difficult to track, monitor.
Yeah, I mean, once you've got an intelligence base, though, you can see these things from outer space. They're so big, and so the drug squad's been very successful in the last couple of years with these operations.
Which brings me to my final question, I suppose, around what recommendations or additional resourcing would be needed to make it your jobs easier and also to decrease that supply and disrupt it?
There's no doubt that our impact is limited by our budget, but I imagine most public sector agencies would say that. It's clear that if we had more resources, we could do more of the work that would result in more organised criminals having enforcement action taken against them.
I have a question. Have you seen a decrease or like a complete disappearance of organised crime importing cannabis from overseas? Anecdotally, there used to be quite a lot of, I've heard a lot of hashish in Australia in the 1970s and 1980s, but that doesn't seem to be the case now. Has that part of organised crime disappeared and been replaced by domestic cultivation?
I have no recollection of a cannabis importation in recent times. I have no recollection of it. I'm not saying there isn't one, but I remember there used to be those blocks of hashish they used to import from Southeast Asia. Yeah.
In the red sellers phase?
Yeah. But in recent times I haven't heard of one.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much. I think we're done with questions. We very much appreciate you coming along today to give evidence and the work you do for the people of New South Wales. So thank you very much for making the time. I think there was a couple of questions taken on notice, and the Secretariat will be in contact with you in due course to get some answers to those. But again, thank you very much for your evidence and the work you do.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you.
members.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, good morning, Mr. Carlin and Miss Higgins. Thank you very much for your attendance today at the hearings into the impact of the regulatory framework for cannabis in New South Wales. Before we hear from you, I'll start on my left. Could each witness, so you, Miss Higgins, please state your name and position title and swear either the oath or affirmation, please.
Louise Higgins-Witten, Director, Road Safety Policy, Transport for New South Wales. I swear that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help me God.
Thank you very much, Ms Higgins. Mr Carlin.
Bernard Carlon, Chief of the Centres for Road Safety and Maritime Safety, Transport for New South Wales. I swear that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help me God.
Thank you very much. We will start, before I go to questions, do you have some introductory remarks you'd like to make?
Yeah, we do have a brief opening statement that we'd like to make. So
thank you very much, Mr Carlin.
I was fortunate to be able to attend the Drug Summit last week and hear firsthand the challenges faced by those using medicinal cannabis in terms of driving. Transport acknowledges the difficulties they face. However, there is a need to balance that against the road safety outcomes for the whole of the community. The New South Wales Government's committed to ambitious targets for halving road deaths and serious injuries by 30% by 2030. It's currently against the law for someone to drive with THC present in their oral fluid, blood or urine in New South Wales. Research shows that THC can affect the skills required for safe driving, including attention, judgment, concentration, memory, vision, coordination and decision making, and the increased crash risk for those drivers by up to 40%. Between 2019 and 2023, there were 233 fatal crashes, representing 16% of all fatal crashes, which resulted in 252 fatalities involving drivers and riders who had the presence of THC in their system. About a third of these included the presence of another drug, and a quarter had illegal levels of alcohol. The mobile drug testing program is a critical road safety tool to deter driving after use of key drugs we know impact on safe driving skills. Research completed by Monash University in Victoria shows that a system of broad-based roadside drug testing has a positive impact on road safety. I'd like to make it clear that the oral fluid test devices and process we use in New South Wales is designed to detect recent THC use. THC levels spike quickly after consumption and then rapidly drop in oral fluid. All samples are subject to laboratory analysis where a confirmatory limit is applied, and claims that oral fluid testing detects THC many days after use is not supported by the scientific evidence. I note that evidence regarding specific effects of the range of medicinal cannabis products on safe driving is still in development. We're aware that duration of impairing effects can vary significantly between individuals and typically last for 3 to 8 hours depending on the administration, the amount taken and the frequency of dose. We also know that at present there's no scientific consensus on an acceptable THC level in blood that indicates a degree of impairment and crash risk as there is for alcohol. For these reasons, it's not simply a case of picking up an approach being deployed in another jurisdiction and implementing it in New South Wales. The evidence base needs to be clear in order not to jeopardise road safety outcomes. To this end, Transport continues to actively monitor research, technological developments and approaches being deployed in other jurisdictions. We're actively considering this evidence as it develops. We thank you for the opportunity to appear before the committee, and we look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Cullen. I'll now turn to questions from the government.
Thanks, Chair. Firstly, for Mr. Carlon, just on that point about 16% of fatalities involving THC being detected, I assume, in the blood of the person driving the vehicle, is that testing similar to the roadside testing that's done in terms of the sensitivity, i.e., is that THC in the blood that indicates recent use, or is that blood testing stronger than the roadside saliva testing?
Okay, so I'll answer in brief and maybe pass to Louise in terms of the technical details, but just to clarify, that testing for those results in fatal crashes is blood tests, and it measures the levels of THC in the bloodstream. And the roadside drug testing program is a screening device which is applied an oral fluid device, which is the detection of recent use in oral fluid in the mouth cavity. 2 screening tests are done at the roadside, and then the oral fluid is captured in the secondary test and goes to the laboratory, where confirmation of the presence of THC in the oral fluid is conducted by the laboratory.
Yeah, I suppose what I was driving at is, does that 16% figure indicate that THC was present in that person's blood to a degree that would have affected their driving capacity or driving ability?
I think that, again, it's a complex issue because there are a whole range of factors, including the time at which the blood might have been taken. As we've said, THC spikes very quickly and then deteriorates in terms of its presence over a number of hours. But I might ask Louise to chime in terms of some of the details there.
Sure, thanks, Mr. Cullen.
Yeah, so we're certainly aware that the pharmacokinetics of cannabis are really quite complex, and that depending on the biological matrix, whether we're talking about blood, urine, oral fluid, the amount of time and the type of substance that you're looking at the times will vary. So we're aware that when we get blood results from fatal crashes, that comes to us from FAS at New South Wales Health, and the blood measurements can go down quite low. There is variation and complexity here because some of the subjects that the blood is taken from will be already deceased when the blood is taken, so there's some complexities about picking those raw results up. Some of them are taken from those involved in fatal crashes that are still alive. And as Mr. Cullen mentioned, there can be variation in the time when that blood sample is taken. So obviously when there is a fatal crash, the priority is patient care, and then New South Wales Health will take the sample. We know that THC is eliminated from the blood relatively quickly. It has a relatively quick half-life. So there is quite a bit of variation in picking up that raw result. Which is why we talk about it as presence. We're not saying that all of those drivers were definitively impaired and that was the primary cause or primary contributor to the crash. It is that the substance is present there, and given that we know it can affect driving skills, we outline that it is there and may have been a contributor to that fatal crash.
Sure. So with alcohol, it's obviously fairly well understood in the community that you can consume a certain amount of alcohol and still be under 0.05, and there's obviously disputation around exact formulas. So it used to be advertised, I think, 2 in the first hour, 1 every hour after that. I think they might have moved away from that, but it still may be a fairly effective kind of rule of thumb that people bear in mind. Is there anything similar for cannabis? So, for example, if we were going to recommend a medicinal cannabis defence for driving, what's happening in the research in terms of a way for people to consume cannabis in compliance with some kind of formula or rule of thumb that will guide them about whether they're safe to drive? Is there anything of that nature, or is it all just too complex and indeterminate?
Yeah, so I might, again, in terms of the details, ask Louise to respond, but I think it's important to understand that even with alcohol, there's a significant variation in individuals in the way in which it actually metabolizes and impacts on driving skills, which is why we have, over the last more than a decade, moved away from having individuals attempt to determine whether or not they may or may not actually be over the limit. And of course, we now have 0 for our most vulnerable road users in terms of novice drivers. And certainly the Plan B approach is, if you're going to have a drink, don't drive, which is the advice that we regularly over the last decade have been giving the community in order to get rid of that, I suppose, decision-making that individuals may make where, we can't reliably tell them, depending on the alcohol content of individual drinks that they might be drinking and volumes and glass sizes, that there is a reliable way in which they can moderate. And so we say to people, you're going to drive, then have a plan B. If you're going to drink. Similarly, the complexities are even more so in THC currently, and so we have a large body of research over 40 years in establishing the framework for alcohol. And certainly there's a lot of research that is happening, but it's very recent in relation to THC and even more recent in relation to THC in medicinal cannabis. So I might hand to Louise as well. But
yeah, look, just to add around, when we do the comparison to alcohol, from a road safety research perspective, we have established over more than 50 years now a very clear and definitive link between the amount of alcohol you take and your degree of impairment, and then a connection directly back to your degree of crash risk. And this research started back in the 60s with the Grand Rapids research, it's called, and has been improved over time and validated in studies time and again, that's really shown us that consistent increase whereby when you have more alcohol in your system, you have that increased risk, and we've been able to link it back to crash results. We don't necessarily have that research base to draw on in relation to THC, so we haven't been able to see in the research that definitive and clear path upwards with increases in amount of THC, and also in terms of that point at which we start to see an increase of risk. So that number, 0.05 is the number where we say we have a doubling of casualty crash risk for alcohol. We don't have scientific consensus around what that baseline number is for THC. So we see in jurisdictions where they have attempted to put in place an impairment level, that number does vary from 0.5 in jurisdictions like France. In some jurisdictions, say in Colorado, that number is 5 nanograms per mil. So it's quite a variation and different process.
Those numbers were important. That was 0.5, you said nanograms per mil.
Nanograms per mil, yeah.
Of blood.
Of blood, that is in whole blood, yes. Yep. And there is also variation. So some jurisdictions measure in whole blood, some measure in plasma, some measure in serum. I'm not an expert in these biological matrices, but there is some difference in them.
So that's only useful, I suppose, for the potential driver. I mean, it might be a way of working out liability for a criminal offence after the event, I suppose, but it's only useful for the driver to the extent that it can be synthesised into some sort of instruction or rule that a person can understand in advance of driving and try to comply with. So if we were, for example, to recommend the creation of a medicinal cannabis defence in the law to driving, is there some sort of limitation or rule or guideline that you would suggest that we consider in terms of amount of time since you've consumed cannabis, or the amount of cannabis that you should have consumed within a certain time, or something of that nature?
Or the type of user you may be, like a novel, like a new user, as opposed to someone who's been using for a while.
Look, I think trying to find a really a consistent rule of thumb that could be put into the law would be quite challenging. So we know that in terms of medicinal cannabis products, there are over 500 non-TGA approved products that could be used. Some of them have THC concentrations of up to 98%, and a lot of people are using these for varying conditions, potentially with other products, and in different concentrations and dosages. Bernard mentioned in the opening statement there that there's a guidance around the window of impairment in the realm of kind of up to 8 hours. That does vary depending on the route of administration. So whether someone is inhaling or taking an oral dose, it does vary depending on how much you're taking, and a range of other individual factors. So doctors, when prescribing, obviously need to give their patients individual advice based on what they've prescribed. But that does add this layer of complexity to the task of the committee.
So how well equipped a doctor's going to be to really meaningfully give advice? Because I'm mindful that in respect to your Valiums and so forth and driving, I think you must have consumed them in accordance with medical advice. That's then a defence, I think, or you're not liable for any particular criminal offence if you've done that. But how well, I mean, if we were to, for example, recommend a medicinal use defence for the relevant criminal offences in respect of cannabis that's conditioned on someone complying with medical advice, how well are doctors equipped to meaningfully give advice about what is safe or not safe in terms of overall community outcomes in respect of road safety?
I think I'd firstly say that's probably a question for health in that context. I think that there is sort of a range of complicating factors in nonetheless, the volume of product that's actually available, which there's 2 out of more than 500 that have been approved by TGA, and so there's a very vast array of product that's actually being available under the prescriptions currently being issued. But we also have some sociological sort of issues that we also need to come to grips with, and so some of those, including a recent study conducted in 2022, and whilst there's a proportion of the community who are taking medicinal cannabis because they really require it from a health management perspective, and it's recommended by their medical practitioner, and that have never taken THC or cannabis previously either. That's clearly a group in the community who are following their medical advice. But we do know in the research that there's a National Household Drug Survey found that people who take cannabis for medicinal purposes, 70% of them did so without a prescription. So they're saying we're taking it for a medicinal purpose but don't have a prescription. And then there's another study that essentially also a significant proportion of people who are traditional recreational cannabis users, who say that they are using medicinal cannabis along with their recreational cannabis sourced from another source. Yeah. And so that does confound, I think, the situation in relation to a exemption or some other legal process at the moment. I think there's more research that is actually required specifically in the medicinal cannabis area.
Yeah. So just lastly from me, in the jurisdictions that have created a medicinal use defence, which on the evidence before us includes Tasmania, are you aware of any research on any effect on road safety outcomes in those jurisdictions?
Yeah, we're not aware of research that Tasmania in particular has done. We have spoken to them to better understand how their exemption operates. Yeah. And look, I think as Bernard highlighted, the THC is the same substance in therapeutic products as it is in illegal cannabis. So one of the challenges for any defence is being able to understand that the person has taken their substance as it has been prescribed and in the way that is being prescribed by the doctor. By only taking an oral fluid sample at the roadside, we can't determine that, and that is the primary way that we enforce our MDT, mobile drug testing offences. So you really do need that blood to be able to determine if the person has taken definitively or close to definitively, with more confidence perhaps, that the person has taken their substance in accordance with the prescription. Otherwise, we have this risk, as Mr. Collins highlighted, that we don't know whether they've taken the substance as intended or potentially with other source of THC. But even when that level is available in the blood, it doesn't tell us which source that it's come from. So the way we understand the exemption to work in Tasmania is that a charge isn't progressed if a person can provide a prescription. There isn't any validation in Tasmania that the drug has been taken in accordance with the prescription. So provided the person can provide to police their prescription that's been validly made under the Poisons Act in that jurisdiction, that the charge doesn't proceed.
Yeah.
Yes.
So just broadly, you're not aware of any research, whether internationally or here, just broadly on the question of what happens to road safety outcomes when you legalise driving with medicinal cannabis in your system?
So there is some research. There's a lot of emerging research when it comes to medicinal cannabis specifically and its effect on driving.
Yep.
A lot of our understanding comes from recreational cannabis use, which is somewhat applicable because it's the same substance but not completely. So there is emerging research coming in that space. We can look to the experience in, for example, the US. Yep. And we know that where medicinal cannabis has been introduced, if they look at crash rates overall, the few studies that have been done don't show that you get an increase in your overall crash rate from just having medicinal cannabis. Having said that, there are also some studies that are showing that if we're talking about the broader legalisation of recreational use and the broader access to cannabis products, that's when it appears from some of the research studies in the US that you start to see those shifts in crash rates at the state level overall. But I would just put a caveat on that, noting that the US is quite a different enforcement culture to what we have in Australia in terms of having that history, very established history of RBT and successful history of random stopping.
So would you be able to provide us with a summary of that overseas research?
Yes, happy to take on notice and provide you some
That'd
research.
be great.
Thank you very much.
And I think just to just go back to Tasmania experience as well. In particular, we're unlikely to see, any definitive research in that area where their total fatalities in Tasmania are on average 10 fatalities per annum total. And their roadside drug testing program is around 50,000 tests compared to our 200,000 in New South Wales target. So the relative trauma in New South Wales is significantly more as well in that context.
Yep. Certainly. Thank you, Mr. Carl.
Thank you. The opposition, some questions?
Yes, just following on from that one, in relation to the research of the data that you provide and the breakdown, can you also break it down from, if possible, medicinal use versus non-medicinal use in relation to incidences overseas?
So certainly for the research information, we can definitely provide whether it was a study specific to medicinal cannabis or not.
Yep.
We can't do that with our own crash data because the substance is the same substance.
Although, did you say that if a person is then asked whether or not they're on prescribed medicinal cannabis, is that recorded at all? Or is it just listed as a person tested positive?
So do you mean within our crash
yes,
data?
within New South.
Yeah, we don't know that. So
Okay.
I think the only, I would say the only circumstance where we would know that a person who's been involved in a fatal crash was taking a prescription could potentially be if the matter goes through a coronial investigation, and then it may come to light when they do that very forensic look at what was present in the system and the other factors that contributed to the crash.
And in relation to New South Wales specifically, do you have data breakdown between crashes, collisions versus that led to death and no death?
You mean the serious injury data? Again, the data availability for serious injury crashes is not very strong, although there are proposals within our Road Safety Action Plan to mandate the collection of that data where there is a grievous bodily harm incident, and we're working with New South Wales Police and others around that reform in particular, which would lead to better quality information around those serious injury type crashes.
And what's the time frame for that?
We're currently working with those agencies in order to provide a package to government in terms of bringing legislation forward.
Okay. In relation to Operation Raid that occurred a few months ago, that was looking at impairment, a driver impairment over a 4-day period. Did you have any involvement in that, or was that purely all police?
I think that'd be a matter you need to take up with New South Wales Police.
Okay, then. That's fine.
In terms of just following on from Ms McLaren-Jones around the data collection for prescriptions, is there a process that would make it easy to collect that data? Like, at what point do you collect that data?
Look, we don't collect data as to people's prescriptions, so obviously that would be between them.
So what's the process for you getting the data that you receive at the moment, and is there a way to influence the collection of that original data so that you can have that additional point of information?
So that data is collected in terms of the crash investigation by police. So those data are collected, and we look at all of those contributing factors to individual crashes, as well as the vehicle type and the conditions of the road network and the whole system, and the likelihood of contribution of any parts of the system to that crash or the fatal or serious injury outcomes. The data in relation to the presence of drugs in the blood actually comes from our health laboratories, and so they're testing, and I understand that they're giving evidence to the committee as well, and so happy for them to, maybe for us to refer that question to them about the collection of that information and the availability of additional information that might come from them and the police investigation.
So if that data was required, it could come from perhaps police or health? If there was going to be a point at which you asked someone, for example, if they had a script.
That would normally come from police, normally in the first instance.
Thank you. And on impairment, are there examples internationally of impairment tests that are not related to the collection of samples but are related to behaviour? Like, I think I wasn't alive, I don't think, when we had the kind of, hold your hand above your head and walk in a straight line, hopping on one foot sort of test, but is there an example of that internationally that's related to other substances?
Yes, I've got to say in our regulatory framework as well, so the offence, which is the sort of more severe offence of driving under the influence, where police actually observe the nature of driving and the condition of the individual, is of that similar sort of category, and they arrest them for the purpose of a blood test to validate the levels of any impairing drugs. The international jurisdictions, there are a range of different tests that are done at the roadside, and I might hand over to Louise in terms of the framework. The assessment and research around this area is there's a high degree of variability in the those approaches as well internationally in terms of their veracity. So.
Yeah, look, and I'd just add that as Ben mentioned, there is a degree of variability. There's also differences in the approach and who conducts those particular tests. So depending on the jurisdiction you're in, what is involved in those tests does vary. There are some standardised field sobriety type tests that have been used, particularly in the US, and studies have looked at their efficacy in identifying impairment and have validated them, particularly for alcohol. There's been some studies to look at how well running through those particular tests identifies cannabis, and there is, as been mentioned, some variability. You obviously have to be trained in some of these more sophisticated sobriety assessments to be able to undertake them reliably. In some jurisdictions, they require a medically trained person to undertake them, and there's multiple steps. So the answer is that there is tests available, and they are complex and they do vary from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. There are some challenges with them in terms of picking up more subtle signs of impairment and to always being able to identify impairment.
Mm-hmm. So are you able to go into some more detail about what that actually looks like in a couple of particular cases, perhaps some of the more successful ones that you're aware of?
Yeah, look, I mean, it is an emerging space, but I can, for example, speak to the position in Colorado.
Mm-hmm.
So they use a number of different sobriety assessment type tools. One is a standardised field sobriety assessment, which is based on physical signs and symptoms. All police are trained to do this base level of assessment at the roadside. They then have a more sophisticated type of assessment, which is called the Advanced Roadside Impaired Driving Enforcement program, and that allows certain officers that are trained to undertake different types of impairment tests. So it looks at things like pupil eye function, walking tests, lack of eye convergence and other physical signs in the driver. Mm-hmm. And about 40% of the police officers are trained in this, so it's a more complex test to be able to undertake. And then there's a third layer of standardised assessment in that jurisdiction, which is called the Drug Recognition Expert Test, and that's a very comprehensive assessment of drug impairment, and only about 1% of the police in Colorado are trained to do that piece. So it's quite a sophisticated steps they run through from the point of stopping someone at the roadside and where they think there are signs of impairment, and quite a resource intensive approach to prosecute a driver in that jurisdiction.
Okay, so are those tests used for lots of different substances?
Yeah, my understanding is that they can be used for other substances. We've spoken specifically to Colorado about their use in this context, in the context of THC. That's been a particular challenge there with the legalisation of cannabis in. And
what was their response to your questions?
Well, look, they provided this information for us. Yeah.
So, is it something that they have continued for a long time? Like, what's the revision or reflection on their program?
Look, my understanding is that this is only a relatively recently introduced series of steps. Obviously, that legalisation has happened only in the past decade or so, but I'd need to take on notice if you're happy for us to provide more information about the Colorado position on notice when it was introduced.
That would be greatly appreciated.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to lastly ask about the prevalence in New South Wales of impairment tests related to other prescription-based medications and impairment or risks to driving. Is there any comparison in terms of data that you've collected on like legal, say, opioids or other prescriptions that might have an effect on driving, and they're like whether people are being prosecuted or picked up for impairment of those types of substances as compared to THC?
Yeah, look, and we do have those incidents where under the driving under the influence offence, where there's identification of an individual through their behavioural driving, information around those drugs which have been proven following a sort of pharmacological assessment to be impairing. And so that data is, and I think we could take on notice to provide that information to the committee. Certainly, I think we're in a very different context with THC in that it has been a recreational sort of illicit drug use for many decades, and we're more recently seen the emergence of medicinal cannabis or THC in that context, and so. And there's a large variety of product on offer as well, and so it's from our point of view, and it's a from a recreational purpose or illicit use, a much more significant number of people who are actually using it as well. But as we see the emergence of medicinal cannabis use as well, that's an issue where we believe there's we need more research in that area in order to identify how we might manage any system changes from the current oral fluid testing system. But Louise as well might like to. We do have a research program that the last parliamentary inquiry into this area, and we committed to monitoring the research, and we have done a significant body of work over the last couple of years, but there are, I think, potential for us to be doing more in some areas as additional research that we've been monitoring in other jurisdictions is better informed potentially where we need to fill gaps in this area.
And what would those be?
So I might hand to Louise around what we've been doing in that research program, as well as where there's potential for us to be doing additional sort of studies along that line.
So just in relation to the question about whether we have something comparable around sobriety assessment, so obviously Colorado has quite a multi-tiered approach to their sobriety assessment, and this is linked to I guess a different factor in Colorado being that drivers there have the right to refuse giving blood tests as part of their legal framework. In terms of the most comparable thing that we have in New South Wales to it, so under our Act, if police suspect that a person is impaired by a prescription drug, they can conduct a field sobriety assessment, and that is conducted in accordance with New South Wales Police standard operating procedures. So that they may be in a position to provide some information to the committee about the detail of that. The Act allows them to do that, and when a person fails that sobriety assessment, they can then take that person to a hospital and have the blood taken, and at that point the blood is analysed for a full spectrum of drugs, be they illegal, prescription, and that brief of evidence can then be provided to identify that. Okay. In terms of the research steps that we're currently taking, so we've commissioned
I was actually also interested in the research steps that maybe have a gap. You just mentioned, Ms. Cahalan, that there were some areas that you'd like to move into and that there were some gaps. So I'm just in the interest of time, because I'm mindful that Mr. Buckingham hasn't had any questions. So I am interested in what you're doing, but it might be a little bit easier to find that information. So just interested in what kind of gaps that you see and where there are areas that you would actually like to expand your research into.
Look, I think the connection between our oral fluid testing program and the outcomes that we see in terms of the blood levels in crashes, it's clearly there is research that's been done, and I think you're speaking to Swinburne University, and so very recent studies that are showing up, I think, and confirming the facts that THC is a drug that affects your safe driving skills, no matter where it comes from, and developing sort of more robust models in the way in which we have seen for establishing the alcohol-related system that we currently have, which, as Louise has mentioned, was developed over a 50-year period. We're in a very early period of research around the impact from a road safety perspective of these drugs. We do know what is certain is that the THC has an impact on your safe driving skills, and there's a number of research studies that have confirmed that. It's the connection between that and the levels at which individuals might be impaired over time, and the levels at which that we can confidently match that in the way that we have with our alcohol system, to being able to put in place a regulatory framework that allows for Australia to continue its world leadership in mass screening programs that provide a deterrent effect for the community. So we know that our experience in RBT and alcohol-related crashes through that journey on the development of that research, has seen us go from 390 people killed, 389 people killed in 1980, down to 36 in 22. So we, can see the risks associated with, drug use and drug impacting on your safe driving skills. And we would like to be moving towards that system.
Sorry, Mr. Cullen, what were those figures? Those figures were they were the total road toll in New South Wales?
No, this is in 1980, 389 people were killed in alcohol-related crashes alone in New South Wales in 1980, compared to 36 in 2022.
Okay.
Can I just clarify, just in relation to the research, are you undertaking any specific research in New South Wales?
I'll be happy to have Louise outline what we're currently doing in that area.
So we've commissioned an attitudinal research piece with users of both recreational drugs and prescription drugs to better understand the prevalence of drug driving and attitudes and behaviours towards drink driving. And that piece is currently out in field. We're expecting results from that early next year, which will give us a better understanding of self-reported behaviours when it comes to drug driving, how often people are doing it, when they're doing it. We've included medicinal cannabis questions within that research for the first time. It's research that we have done before and we're building on, but we've now included medicinal cannabis within that research piece. We've also been doing internal research to make sure we keep abreast of any research that arises in this space. And that includes doing a scan of what's happening internationally. As I mentioned, speaking to counterparts in other jurisdictions such as Colorado. We have also identified that there is a potential to look in more depth at some of that data we already have from fatal crashes to better understand how the substances, be they illegal or prescription, may have actually affected drivers, and if we have any emerging trends potentially with new drugs where we see a road safety risk. We're also keeping in touch with colleagues in Victoria. You may be aware that they have commissioned a major piece of research, a closed track trial, which I assume that potentially the witnesses from Swinburne can talk in more detail about. They're running that piece for the Victorian government, but we are keeping a close eye on that because it is a world first in a sense that it will look at the actual effect that taking the medicinal cannabis then has on factors such as braking, steering, in a closed track environment, which is a more realistic environment to better understand the actual real world impact that the substances have compared to, say, a simulator type study. So that is a really interesting and emerging piece we're watching as well.
And in relation to the testing of not so much impairment but the presence of THC in the body. So at the moment it's purely blood testing that is the most reliable form of testing.
If we want to get an indication of the level, a reliable indication of the level that can potentially confirm or deny that a person has taken the substance in accordance with a prescription, then the blood is probably the gold standard in terms of the approach of being able to have. We can't get from an oral fluid level alone an indication of whether they've taken their prescription in accordance with the doctor's advice.
And does that mean that, in your opinion, the oral testing doesn't allow for an accurate read, let alone, I suppose, an ability to judge a person's ability or impairment?
Look, we know that the oral fluid provides an indicator of recent use, because we know that THC is present in the oral fluid immediately after use, and then it's rapidly eliminated. So it does, if we can detect the THC in oral fluid, it does indicate that THC has recently been used, and we know from the other evidence that window around when you use the substance is when we're most likely to see the effects on driving skills. So there's definitely a connection there between when we see the substance present at detectable levels in the oral fluid and back to what we know about when drivers are most likely to be impaired in terms of that window of hours after use, because it is a substance that is it is a matrix where you see the substance there soon after use and not for days and weeks after.
Ms. Higgins, are there any jurisdictions that rely on an oral test to establish, or like a roadside test, to establish a level of THC presence, not just presence, but a level of THC presence upon which that they then establish a regime of road safety? Are there any jurisdictions in the world that have a roadside test that tests for nanograms, in terms of saliva or anything like that?
Yeah, I think I understand what you mean. So you mean in terms of a graded approach, kind of like equivalent to 0.05 or 0.08 or whatever.
Are there any
we're talking
devices about, or any jurisdictions that rely on that?
Not that we're aware. So that is, I think, a missing piece in the evidence. So following through, we talked about what we know about alcohol, in that as you have that presence going up, you see the crash risk going up. We don't have that piece of evidence showing that as the volume of THC in oral fluid goes up, it's directly linked back to an escalation in crash risk.
Now, in relation to the 16% of fatal road accidents where there was a test, there was cannabis found to be present, is that in the person who was found at fault and deceased, or anyone who was deceased in those accidents?
So no, we're testing the driver or rider involved in a crash.
Yes.
And so any driver or rider involved in a crash, a fatal crash, is being tested for their blood in terms of the presence of those drugs and the level of those drugs at that time.
They may not necessarily be deceased, or they may not necessarily have been at fault.
That's correct. So
Okay.
in terms of the way in which we're attempting to reduce risk from a road safety perspective is actually identifying where particular behaviours or the absence of a particular part of the system for managing whether there is risk. If there's risk, then we're monitoring those.
But what I'm
those
trying to establish,
inputs.
Mr. Cullen, is if someone who doesn't have THC crashes into someone who does have THC in their system, that shows up into your figure. Someone who, say, was speeding and doesn't have THC in the system crashes into someone who's driving with THC in the system, and one or both of those people is deceased, your figures will show that person had THC and turns up in your figures.
Yeah, that's correct, because we don't analyse the road safety sort of say systems approach on the basis of fault. We analyse it on the basis of what the risks are in a
what
crash,
risks are.
and had that person not had that in their system, they may be able to avoid that crash. So I think that's the systems approach that's been adopted internationally around assessment of risk in crashes, and then the attempt to eliminate those risks over time.
What percentage of those serious accidents where there's a fatality was there? Was it only cannabis found in the blood of those persons involved? Where there was no alcohol, illegal alcohol, other illicit substances or prescription medications?
Yeah, so if I can, I just have before me, I'm happy to provide more detail on notice, but in those where THC has been identified, around a quarter had the presence of alcohol and about a third had the presence of another illicit drug. In those total crashes, of those total fatal crashes over the last 5 years, that there were 233 and 241 drivers or riders where the presence of THC was involved in the crash.
Yes, I understand that, but how many were just THC?
Don't have that in front of me, but I'm happy to provide it on notice.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, that was very good. Look, we've run over time. Do you want
Just
one
one
more? Are
question,
you going to
is that
sell?
right? Yeah.
All right. Okay.
As-
One more from Mr.
Thanks,
Lyons.
Mr. Chair. If we were to move to a medicinal cannabis defence to drive illicit, would you expect to see an increase in adverse road safety outcomes based on the international research that you've looked at?
Oh, look, I don't think we're in a position to do that. There are a number of different ways in which you might implement that. There are different exemptions versus defence processes that would result in different outcomes, and so it would depend on the model that was being adopted. And so I think it would be difficult for us to comment, but we're happy to, again, share the research that's available internationally from that perspective.
Thank you.
Well,
Thanks,
thank you
Louise.
very much, colleagues, for your excellent questions and the quantity of them. And I thank you, Mr. Carlin and Ms. Higgins, for your excellent evidence. It's been very informative and will certainly help with the inquiry and our report. Again, thank you for taking the time to appear today and for the work that you do for the people of New South Wales. We very much appreciate it. The Secretariat will be in contact in due course with some of those matters that you took on notice.
Thank you.
And thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Colleagues, we've run a little bit over time, so you've got 8 minutes to grab some refreshments.
I suppose I could trouble you for your notes to answer.
cannabis in New South Wales. Before we commence, I need to get you to each, starting with you, Professor, to state your name and position title and swear either an oath or affirmation, please.
My name is Professor Ian McGregor. I'm Academic Director of the Lambert Initiative for Cannabinoid Therapeutics at the University of Sydney. I solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Thank you very much, Professor. Dr. McCartney, if you could do the same.
I'm Dr. Danielle McCartney. I'm a research fellow at the Lambert Initiative for Cannabinoid Therapeutics at the University of Sydney. And I solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence now about to be given shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Thank you very much. Do you have some introductory remarks you'd like to make before we go to questions?
Yes, I'd be happy to speak for about 2 minutes or thereabouts.
Thank you.
First of all, thank you for the opportunity to give evidence today. And I'd also like to congratulate the committee on the interim report, which I thought was extremely informative and thorough. We're scientists, so we work in the area of evidence. And I thought you marshalled the evidence around these issues particularly well. The Lambert Initiative is a philanthropically funded centre at the University of Sydney for investigating the benefits and possible harms of medicinal cannabis. We do a lot of work on clinical trials of medicinal cannabis products. We do quite a lot of work with patients, surveys of patients and prescribers. We do some policy work. But probably most importantly, we work on the development of new cannabis-based medicines. So they're actually mostly lab boffins, and we are developing a range of very exciting products from the cannabis plant. There are more than 500 different bioactive molecules in the plant, and we have a broad range that we're investigating for a whole range of different conditions. As a result of the work that we do in the community, we've tracked the changes in patient access to medicinal cannabis over the past decade, and it's been nothing short of remarkable. Necessarily in that work, we often come into contact with people who are using cannabis illegally, and indeed in the early days, 2017, 2018, when we were surveying medicinal cannabis patients, the vast majority of them were self-medicating with illicit medicinal cannabis. And that has changed in the course of our surveys. In our last CAMS 22-23 survey, more than 70% were getting prescribed cannabis. There are two things I think we want to bring to our evidence today. One is the idea that pharmacies could actually become an outlet for non-medicinal, non-prescription cannabis. We quite like that idea from our studies. When we look at current people receiving prescriptions for medicinal cannabis products, it seems that a sizable minority of them are getting the prescriptions primarily for entertainment purposes rather than medical purposes. And I think this is worth exploring. In some ways, we already have legalization of cannabis by stealth through the use of prescription products. And so that puts us in something of a position of strength in relation to access for patients. The second thing which we'd like to talk about today is a study we've just done in the ACT, where we surveyed more than 300 cultivators, and I think that may have been circulated to you today. And it was a very interesting look at the experience of cultivators, but we also analysed their cannabis. There's concerns, of course, that cannabis that's being cultivated at home may not meet criteria in terms of quality. And so that chemical analysis was actually very informative, and we found very few red flags with home-cultivated cannabis, and also got a range of very interesting insights about the lived experience of cultivators and the effects of legislative change. So the two things we're interested in terms of policy change are perhaps to use pharmacies to supply a non-medical market, but also as kind of low-hanging fruit for decriminalisation or depenalisation, to allow people to grow plants at home, cultivate if they can. I realise that young people often can't afford to have a home with a garden, in Sydney at least, but to allow people cultivation would be a very constructive step forward, and the findings from our ACT survey certainly support that.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Professor. We'll now turn to questions from the government members.
Thanks, Chair. Thanks very much for your evidence. Just wanted to firstly ask you for some thoughts on what's the line between cannabis as a medicine and cannabis as a substance that people use because they feel the desire / need to use it. Like, at what point is it medicinal, and is at what point is it recreational, do you think, from a sort of underlying point of view?
Well, you started with an excellent question. Our surveys often find that people are dual users. So we've defined that in our cannabis as medicine surveys as people that are using both medically and non-medically. And it's really the two things go hand in hand. It was the same with our survey of cultivators in the ACT, that a lot of them were growing for both medical and non-medical purposes. There's no sharp division, actually, because if you think of what cannabis does, you're causing euphoria, you're, in psychological parlance, we talk about lifting hedonic tone, hedonic tone being the extent to which you find happiness in the world around you. If you lift hedonic tone, that can have what I call entertainment value, so you enjoy music more, you enjoy movies more, you enjoy food more, all of these sort of effects. But if you have an underlying depression or anxiety about your existence, then that is also alleviated. So, you know, in a sense, recreational, non-recreational, medical, non-medical, they merge together in the human being who's a cannabis user. And it's actually probably the best example of a pure medical user would be someone who develops, say, a neurological illness or chronic pain late in life, who's never actually used cannabis recreationally, and they do exist. And I think it's important to point out that people who come to cannabis quite late in life for medical purposes do often achieve major benefits from that, and have great surprise that they hadn't discovered this medicine earlier.
And what are the main medical benefits of cannabis that are actually proved and accepted?
Okay, so it's funny, the top three things that cannabis is being used for in Australia medically: chronic pain, anxiety, and sleep disturbance. The scientific evidence is still being built around all three of these, and we've often remarked that there's kind of strange dissociation between what patients report in terms of their use and medical benefits and what the kind of gold standard clinical trial evidence that's published in the Lancet and JAMA and all these esteemed medical journals tell us. And it could be that the scientific trials are still trying to catch up. In many ways, it was when we knew this in 2015, it's actually really hard to run clinical trials with a prohibited substance. So it took a while for clinical trials to come along. The other thing which I think is quite interesting is that people that use medicinal cannabis often just have a global improvement in quality of life, which may not necessarily be captured by, you know, a scale from 1 to 10. How much pain are you feeling now between 1 and 10? It might still be 6, you know, but in fact the quality of their life has been greatly improved by the medicine, perhaps as a result of this upregulation of hedonic tone that I referred to earlier.
Yeah. And apart from harms that you can avoid through not smoking it, because it's carcinogenic, obviously, to smoke things, apart from those harms, what are the main harmful effects of cannabis?
The harmful effects are, when used as medically directed, are surprisingly modest. We often laugh because one of the top 5 is appetite stimulation, which we all know about with THC. In some cases, you know, if you've got wasting due to, you know, terminal cancer, that's a positive effect, but that does come up. Lethargy, it comes up a bit. Somnolence, you know, sleepiness, particularly from THC products. Dizziness comes up a little bit as well. With CBD, there's sometimes drug-drug interactions that you have to be mindful of. And then I would say there's certain populations of very vulnerable individuals who have to take particular care or perhaps not use cannabis at all, people with a family history of schizophrenia or bipolar, or people that have experienced these illnesses themselves. And certainly the unborn child needs to be protected because we just don't know enough about THC and CBD during pregnancy. So these are what I would call vulnerable populations, and probably under 18s, although ironically the Lambert Initiative started with a 3-year-old girl who was given cannabinoids for her severe intractable epilepsy, mostly CBD, and this has remarkable benefits for children in that particular case.
Yeah. In terms of psychosis issues, are you able to give us a sense of how statistically significant they are in terms of the vulnerable cohort in the community?
Well, there's a chicken and egg problem, and that basically comes from the observation that people who have schizophrenia, who use cannabis, often get great relief from their anxiety and their symptoms as a result of their cannabis use. So there's a strong statistical association between cannabis use and psychosis as a result of that self-medication. When you try to impute some sort of causality, it gets much more difficult. And I would have to say that the odds of psychosis in someone who's THC positive are probably doubled. But the literature at the moment, despite many very interesting, large-scale, expensive studies, is still a little bit unsure about the causality versus self-medication hypotheses. Hopefully we'll get to the bottom of that eventually. I would point out that CBD is now emerging as a very interesting new treatment for psychosis. We're involved in at least one trial at the moment, in fact 2 trials, one in Brisbane and one in Melbourne, where very high doses of CBD seem to be able to put a brake on psychotic symptoms. The study in Brisbane is actually with the very worst cases of schizophrenia, what they call clozapine-resistant schizophrenia, where basically all existing prescription drugs have failed. And there seem to be some very promising results with very high doses of CBD in that population. So some cannabinoids may actually be very beneficial for schizophrenia.
So just lastly from me, we've taken evidence to the effect that decriminalisation as opposed to legalisation does not lead to an increase in use according to the international research, and therefore doesn't lead to an increase in cannabis-related harms, and that legalisation has internationally led, I think, to fairly modest increases in use and maybe some increases in harm, but in the view, for example, of the Royal College of Psychiatrists, any such increase in harm is offset by the harms that you reduce through decriminalisation and legalisation. And I'm just curious about your view or opinion on those propositions in terms of those important issues of legalisation and decriminalisation.
I would tend to endorse these views. I mean, one thing around our work up in the ACT recently was the recent report from ACT Health that compiled all the data around things like hospitalizations since the 2020 legislative reform up there that allowed people to have 50 grams of dried cannabis and to cultivate at home. And it was there was nothing in that report that was a red flag. And I think in terms of mental health, in terms of cannabis use disorder, in terms of driving, in terms of uptake amongst young people, I mean, they do the wastewater analysis to show the amount of THC in the community, being used in the community, and that didn't change as far as I could understand as a result of these changes. So I've really encouraged people interested in legislative reform to look at the ACT example. I mean, I think we fully enveloped the ACT in New South Wales, so it's a fantastic laboratory for us to study the effects of decriminalisation.
Thanks, Professor. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you. Any more from the opposition? No? The government.
Old habits.
Old habit. The opposition.
Thank you so much for coming today. We'll be back soon. I'm curious about addiction and any differences that you've seen between cohorts who are prescribed medicinal cannabis and those users who are not prescribed but still use cannabis products. Do you know of any differences between the addiction patterns of usage?
It's funny you should mention that. I was just working on a paper last week with Professor Lintzeris, I think, who appeared in front of the committee earlier in the year on this very issue, again taking our large data set from our CAM surveys to look at that issue. As part of that survey, we did get them to complete a survey, a scale for cannabis use disorder. Now, there are certain caveats with that scale. It's an 11-point scale, and to get a diagnosis of mild cannabis use disorder, you just have to tick 2 boxes, which I think is probably a little bit of a low bar. And basically a bar that anyone that uses cannabis daily will probably end up ticking, because there's frequency of use, but also would you miss your drug if it wasn't present? Would you perhaps suffer mild discomfort? There's already 2 boxes that you've ticked, and you've got a diagnosis of CUD. So in our medical users, there was, I think, about 40% of our sample who ticked 2 boxes or more. Now, the thing with dependence on other medications, for example, opioids, when you're looking at dependence on opioid patients, you don't take into account dependence and withdrawal, because it's just assumed that people that are on high doses of morphine or fentanyl or methadone are going to experience dependence and withdrawal. It's just a byproduct of that medical treatment. We haven't arrived at that stage yet with cannabis, and I think we probably should, and Nick has certainly been thinking hard about that with a view to maybe talking to some international colleagues about treating cannabis when used as a medicine the same way as opioids in terms of the way that we measure dependence. I'm a bit of a veteran of running clinical trials on people who are trying to give up cannabis. In the early days, pre-decriminalization, it was only where you could get money from the government to do cannabis research, was to look at people who were addicted and try and get them off the stuff. So we did a number of trials of cannabis withdrawal during that time. The general point I would make is that coming off cannabis is nothing like coming off opioids or alcohol. It's a very benign treatment. It doesn't require hospitalization. There's a little bit of grumpiness, maybe appetite will be inhibited. Insomnia is a major issue as well, but it's not a medical emergency. It's very benign withdrawal compared to benzodiazepines, alcohol, opioids. So I think in summary, we have to be careful about the notion of cannabis use disorder, because it's not a serious medical condition. In terms of medical users, it tends to be a result of just using the medicine as their doctor has instructed. And to answer your actual question, we didn't find meaningful differences in dependence between people who had prescribed medicinal cannabis and people who were using illicit cannabis for medical purposes.
Okay.
I mean, there was moderate differences, but in the end, in our statistical model, they didn't amount to very much.
Yeah, I guess there is a difference between the idea of dependence and withdrawal as opposed to a sense that people would not want to use it anymore. And I suppose that's the difference between if it's prescribed or not, that if you have a doctor and you can say, well, I don't want to use this anymore, so you stop being prescribed the medication, and perhaps can have assistance if that's a problem, as opposed to people who are using it illegally but without a prescription, but don't have that support to exit their use.
Yes, so someone who's suddenly run out of cannabis, who's heavily dependent upon it.
Or some more like somebody who would like to stop but feels like they can't.
Yes, understood. I mean, I think the fact of the matter is that we've had this massive transition from the black market to the green market. Our very first CAM survey in 2016, less than 1% of patients were getting prescribed medicinal cannabis. The last survey was 73%. So most people who at least can afford it can access it.
And you would suspect or suggest, I hope I'm not putting words in your mouth, that it would be easier for people who didn't want to use it anymore to go through their doctor and have that support to not use it anymore.
I think so. I mean, there are so many prescription drugs that you don't stop using suddenly. Antidepressants are an excellent example. Steroids are another one. Opioids as well. So a taper with medicinal cannabis would probably be what an enlightened GP would recommend, and it wouldn't be too difficult to manage, I imagine.
Do you have any stats on the number of people who stop using medicinal cannabis?
I think we've been more focused on the initiation because it was so hard in the early days for people to, and our surveys tend to recruit people who are current users rather than previous users. But I can certainly take that question on notice and see what I can fossick up.
That would be helpful. Thank you.
Thank you. The Lambert Initiative, and I'm mindful that we've got Dr. Arkell later, but you have done some work on the issue of impairment with cannabis. What does the current scientific evidence suggest about the relationship between the presence of THC in a driver's system and actual impairment? What is your research and the research you're aware of suggest in terms of the mere presence of THC impairing a driver?
I've got a world expert to my left, so I'll defer to Dr. McCartney on this one.
I think that's exaggerating, but I'll do my best to answer your question. I think the short answer is that there's not a particularly good relationship between THC concentrations in blood, oral fluid, and metabolites in urine and impairment. We've looked at the correlations, I guess, so comparing the concentrations to the degree of impairment observed and found not a lot present. And we also know that low concentrations of THC can persist in blood for extended periods of time after cannabis use, and we know that at that point in time impairment has resolved. So we do have, I guess that is the short answer to the story there. Yeah, it's not a particularly good relationship.
Thank you. And impairment's a word that's been thrown around a lot, but what's the nature of cannabis impairment according to your research and the research is emerging? How does cannabis impair you in the context of, say, driving and motor skills?
Yeah, so I guess when we study impairment in the lab, there are lots of different types of impairment and different tests of impairment that we use. So most of those tend to be sort of computer-based cognitive function tasks, and they'll measure all kinds of different aspects of cognitive function. So things like reaction time, attention, working memory, like there's a whole spectrum. But our preferred task, and one that we also use in the lab, is driving simulation, where you actually put a participant in what resembles a vehicle, and they sort of operate it using sort of computer screens and steering wheels and everything, exactly the same setup as you'd have in a car. And so we measure all kinds of different things. When it comes to the driving simulator task, the main measure of impairment that we look at with cannabis and all drugs is what's called standard deviation of lane position, or basically how much lateral movement the vehicle makes as it's progressing along the road. And it's a really a sensitive indicator, and it's been shown to correlate tightly with crash risk. And so we do see an increase in SDLP, we call it, with cannabis and other drugs. What we don't often see as much with cannabis is things like speeding behaviour or risky driving behaviour in the driving simulator, like you might see with something like alcohol. With regard to the other cognitive function tasks, we do also see effects. The effects are not usually large, and they do dissipate within a number of hours. So I guess that sort of hopefully summarises that area.
No, it does. Just in terms of we've often heard that the strength of cannabis is diverse, and that but there's a trend towards increasingly strong cannabis and high levels of THC. Is there a big difference between in terms of impacts on mental health and driving between low THC cannabis and high THC cannabis?
This has come up in various contexts. I'm reminded actually of some medical legal work I did in Canada around the transportation industry, and there you can readily access vaping fluids that may have 80% of THC compared to 30% in the strongest plant cannabis. Incidentally, one nice thing about the ACT cultivation study we did was that it was very mild cannabis at about 9% THC. So I don't know if that was because their cultivation wasn't particularly good or the seeds they were using. But anyway, back to your point, what came out in the Canadian cases was the notion of titration, and that is that people don't use high THC products the way they use low THC products. Think of it as whiskey and beer. I mean, you wouldn't go into a pub and order a schooner of whiskey, would you? And that's, well, if you're Scottish, you might.
Mr. Murphy, they've got an Irishman over here.
And it's the same way with cannabis. I mean, there's been studies of this where people have gone into the homes of cannabis users and asked them to use their own cannabis, which is later analyzed for potency. And the people with the very high potency ones tend to use a lot less than the people with the weak cannabis. So much the same as alcohol, people titrate their dose according to the strength of the product. I think that maybe falls apart a little bit where you have more vulnerable populations, young populations, people who are determined to get intoxicated. And there you've obviously got concerns if people are vaporizing, 80% THC fluid and they're going to, get very, very intoxicated on that. But I would suggest that most experienced cannabis users are quite exquisite judges of the doses that they prefer and act accordingly.
Thank you. One of the issues we've received evidence about is quality control. That the black market can't be relied upon to ensure public safety and patient safety and user safety when it comes to the production of cannabis. What are some of the contaminants that potentially you can see, both sort of biological additives that emerge in cannabis, and what are the risks of those?
Well, cannabis is quite a good bioaccumulator, and there's ideas afoot to use hemp to remediate industrial land that is contaminated with heavy metals. In our study of the ACT cultivators, we ran the same tests basically that the TGA should run, but often don't, around cannabis, looking at heavy metals, pesticides and molds. And we were quite reassured actually, with the exception of one sample which had quite high arsenic in it. For the most part, the samples that we analysed met the TGA's standards. So there's concerns in the US market particularly around CBD labeled products also containing THC. That is a thing, and it's been quite widely reported in the scientific literature that some of the dispensary labels are extremely inaccurate. I think the TGA's done at least one study. It would have been 3 or 4 years ago, where they found some discrepancy between labels with some medicinal cannabis products that were prescribed and what was actually there. But I would have to look back at this, but I believe they may have then revised their opinion once industry complained about their tests. I think generally, and your interim report may have actually pointed this out, the TGA should be up-regulating the amount of testing that they do of products. But there's no major alarm bells, apart from maybe synthetic cannabinoids being put in products that are supposed to be cannabis plant, because we know there are some lab manufactured cannabinoids that are 10 or 100 times more potent than THC, in much the same way as fentanyl and its derivatives are much more potent than morphine. You get the same thing with THC. There's all these synthetic cannabinoids, often out of Chinese laboratories. So in very occasional cases, you may have something masquerading as plant cannabis, natural plant cannabis, that actually contains these artificial cannabinoids. But such cases are very few and far between. I haven't heard of any in Australia in recent times.
Has, in your view, has the prohibition on cannabis historically, well, I think you've already said this, historically impacted public perceptions and the development of your scientific research? I think you've already said that it has. It was harder at the beginning to get funding. Is that ongoing? Are you finding it easier to attract money, to attract research dollars, to make the case for research in this area? Is the stigma around cannabis as a medicine and as a recreation or relaxation, whatever you want to call it, is that reducing and then therefore flowing through to an opening up in terms of access to research funding and collaboration across different disciplines?
I think the first point is that you would know yourself from your inquiry so far that there's quite a high level of support now in the community for decriminalisation of cannabis, running at about 80%, which is unprecedented in recent history. So we obviously have a situation in New South Wales where the government and police policy is at odds with the community. And I think that tension means that it's inevitable that eventually something will have to be done to bring legislation into line with community expectations. And I'm really quite enthusiastic that that will occur as a result of this inquiry and other initiatives. With our research, we've certainly found that ethics and governance, which are the kind of arms of university that oversee clinical research in cannabinoids, have become much more familiar with medicinal cannabis. So I used to joke that it would be easier to land a chimp on the moon than to run a clinical trial with cannabis, but that fortunately has now changed, and we don't have too many problems moving forward. What we do find problematic is that the industry is quite impoverished. We have this kind of paradoxical situation where there's more patients than ever, more products being shifted than ever, but whenever we approach industry to run a clinical trial on even one of their own products, it's very hard to get anything out of the companies. And we certainly appeal to the medicinal cannabis industry to be more proactive about supporting research into medicinal cannabis and its benefits. And in some ways you have to ask the question why it's left to some kind-hearted philanthropists to fund a large body of clinical trial research in Australia on medicinal cannabis.
Well, thank you very much for that. How are you, are there any other jurisdictions, you've talked about the ACT, but are there other jurisdictions that you think provide a good model for how we, if we were inclined to deregulate, re-regulate the cannabis sector, that we should be considering in terms of, social and medical and economic opportunities?
I'd go back to my opening comments and suggest something that may be seen as a little bit subversive, but to say that the system that's already in place may actually be a very good system for non-medical cannabis. It's not what the system was intended to provide, but it's extremely clear that large numbers of people in the community are currently accessing cannabis clinics, having a conversation with a GP, and saying that they have back pain, insomnia, a little bit of anxiety, whatever, and very easily obtaining a prescription for cannabis, which they then fill via mail order or in a pharmacy, and then proceed to use that cannabis largely for non-medical purposes. This is a sort of huge elephant in the room that not many people are talking about at the moment. And in some ways it provides a very beneficial model of cannabis supply, non-medical cannabis supply, in as much as you have to at least have that initial conversation with the doctor, who will presumably ask you about your mental health and any family problems with cannabis and so on and so forth, which is a good thing. Then you will get quality controlled cannabis product delivered conveniently, and you'll also be able to show the police that you have a legitimate prescription for that cannabis, and so will avoid the criminal justice system. So, we can look to Portugal, we can look to Canada, we can look to various states in the US, but how about looking at home and asking the question, could we actually tweak that system ever so slightly to provide a model that would be very easily attainable, that we just recognize that this system's being used for non-medical purposes and legitimize that. So you get your quality controlled cannabis from a pharmacy, you always have a conversation with a doctor before you access that cannabis, and then you keep checking in with that doctor every 6 or 12 months as a mandatory approach. I mean, that as well as decriminalization of home cultivation are the two very easy things that we could do, almost tomorrow. And indeed, one of them is already happening, but without the legislative imprimatur. I would encourage people to have a think about that.
So rather than go to the doctor and say, look, I've got insomnia, you just say, I'd like to, improve my hedonic tone.
Yes. Exactly right. And the doctor says, well, tell me about your mental health. Did you have a, father with bipolar disorder? Do you have a safety sensitive job on a mine? I've been working a bit with the mining industry recently, and it's a huge issue there. So the doctor will be briefed to ask all the questions, and then you can call it a card that you can take into a pharmacy, a non-medical cannabis user card, and you just go and fill your script. I think in many ways that would be a win-win. It'd be easily implementable, and it would in many ways guarantee the medical safety of the patient. And the Pharmacy Guild would probably love it as well, because it would be great for business.
Okay, thank you very much. I've got a question from,
thanks, Jim.
yes, Mr. Lawrence, another one.
Dr. McCartney, for you, if we could go back to that impairment question. We took evidence earlier from public servants involved in the road safety area, and they provided us with a statistic that 16% of fatalities, the blood drawn, I think, from people involved in those accidents had THC. And I was wondering, I suspect that you're familiar with that figure maybe, but I was wondering if you could comment on what that says about a causative role of THC in road safety, in adverse road safety outcomes.
That statistic on its own doesn't say a lot about a causative role of THC in the accident. You could measure the caffeine concentration of people in road accidents in their blood and find that 90% of them have caffeine in their blood at the time of the accident, and we know that if anything, caffeine improves driving performance. So it's hard to necessarily draw a lot based on that one individual statistic. I will say that there is evidence that THC does impair driving, unlike caffeine. It's a slightly different story. It's something we definitely need to be mindful of, and there is a risk of, as cannabis law reform occurs, there's a risk of increased people driving under the influence of cannabis. That's there, but to determine the actual numbers like that, it is quite difficult to do. Yeah.
So is that because of things like you don't know about the presence of other substances, you don't know what the presence of THC might say about some other characteristic of that cohort
Yes.
who then become involved in the accident?
That's
There's all these other variables.
That's an important factor, yeah. So,
like young, male, etc., etc.
Yeah, so as you say, young males are more likely to be in traffic accidents, and they're also more likely to use cannabis. So in order to separate those two things, you need more information than the percentage of people in a road accident that have cannabis in their blood. Yep.
Thanks, Doctor. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much, Professor, and thank you very much, Doctor, for your evidence, your submissions, and the work you're doing in the community. We very much appreciate it. It's going to be essential for us. It has been already and will continue to be in our inquiry and deliberation. So thank you very much. There may have been a question or two taken on notice, so if there was, the Secretariat will be in touch in due course, but thank you very much, and wish you all the very best and with the work you're doing. So thank you.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, committee members.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Dr. Arkell, if you could come forward, that would be greatly appreciated. Thank you very much, Dr. Arkell, for making the effort to come up from Melbourne, back to your hometown, to appear at this hearing and to assist the deliberations of this inquiry. Before we kick off, if I could ask you, excuse me, to state your name, position, title, and swear either the oath or affirmation, please.
My name is Thomas Arkell. I'm a research fellow at Swinburne University of Technology. I solemnly, sincerely, and truly declare and affirm that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Thank you very much, Dr. Arkell. Do you have some introductory remarks you'd like to make?
I have a brief one, yeah. I mean, first of all, I'd just like to thank the committee for inviting me to come up and give evidence today. By way of brief introduction, I've been working in cannabis-related research for close to 10 years now. Having completed my PhD at the University of Sydney with Professor McGregor, having worked in the Netherlands and the US, and now in my role at Swinburne University, I've conducted a number of clinical trials, really focused on better understanding whether and to what extent cannabis does actually impact driving and cognition. We're now leading a really quite important on-road driving study that's being funded by the Department of Transport and Planning, which I'm sure you're aware of. And so I really, welcome this inquiry. And I think what is a more nuanced conversation about cannabis, which is, inevitable given what we know about the failures of prohibition, changes overseas, and the enormous growth of medical cannabis here. I also wanted to say that I'm a huge advocate for evidence-based road safety policy, and I'd like to think that when we talk about being world leading in our approach, that we'll rigorously assess that and be, I suppose, transparent about what is working and what isn't working. That's it.
Fantastic. Thank you, Dr. Arkell. Some questions from the government.
Yep, thanks, Chair, and thanks, Dr. Arkell. Just on the road safety issue, we're obviously concerned with a whole range of things, including whether there ought to be a medicinal cannabis use defence to the current criminal offence of driving with an illicit substance in bodily fluid. And I was wondering if you could just talk us through your knowledge of any developments internationally or in Australia in terms of whether such a reform would impact in an adverse way on road safety outcomes.
Well, Victoria has just introduced a change here, so that I think from the 1st of March next year, magistrates will have, the power to exercise discretion as to whether they charge someone, and it really puts the burden of proof onto police to demonstrate that a driver was actually impaired when they were stopped to provide an oral fluid sample. We'll see what that looks like. My feeling there is that these cases are going to be very difficult for police to prosecute. In terms of the number of patients that are actually stopped and will provide their evidence of prescription as defence, I'm going to be really curious to see what that looks like. I don't think we have a good sense of how many people, we have a sense of how many people are driving around with THC in the system that may be prescribed, but as to the number of people that are stopped and oral fluid tested that do have a valid prescription, I really have no idea what that number is, so that's going to be interesting. New Zealand, decided to introduce roadside drug testing a couple of years ago, then went back on that because none of the devices met their standards, and as far as I'm aware, they are now reintroducing that, but patients will have a medical defence. So I think it's a fairly sensible approach. I mean, it's really just bringing cannabis into line, with more or less any other prescription drug we currently have. A counterpoint to that, Canada doesn't provide patients with a medical defence. So if you have THC in your system and it is medically prescribed, that doesn't protect you. But the kicker there is that you would never just be randomly pulled over. Police can do some oral fluid testing there, but they must have a reasonable suspicion that you were impaired by a drug to be able to do that. So it's really quite a different, I think, system, and your interaction with police is very different from what we would typically see here.
Yeah. So we took evidence earlier that there is a connection between cannabis being present in the body and adverse road safety outcomes or risk, but also that in jurisdictions overseas where they've created medicinal use exceptions to criminal offences, that there hasn't been an adverse impact on road safety. So does that in your mind suggest that where you do create such exceptions or regimes, that you just don't ultimately have an increase in the level of people driving with dangerous levels of THC in their system?
That's what it seems to look like. There doesn't seem to be any association between the introduction of medical cannabis laws and the number of people being involved in crashes or fatally injured in crashes. I will say that these statistics can take a long time to really emerge. I'm not sure that we have a great picture of this yet. It's relatively new in Canada. Certainly in some US states it has been around for a while, but it really takes quite a while before trends begin to, you often, for example, see an artificial spike in the first couple of years that may be accompanied by changes in law enforcement efforts. But over time that starts to settle down. You do start to get a better sense of whether, there is any relationship between the two things. But it certainly looks like medical cannabis laws in and of themselves have absolutely no impact on road safety. In terms of legalization, it seems like it may depend a little bit on what that legalization looks like. Yeah. If you have 500 dispensaries within a square mile or kilometre, but much of this data is from the US, and you can drive there at 3 in the morning, they're open 24 hours, and things like that tend to, the number of dispensaries, how easy it is to access it. There are factors that may, I suppose, increase the likelihood that there could be an association between legalisation and road safety, but those things in my mind are very easy to regulate and control with a well-regulated market.
Yeah. So do you think if there's no increase in adverse road safety outcomes when you introduce those sort of defences, does that suggest that, like in Australia, for example, where we've had medicinal cannabis now for 8 years or something, does that suggest that the people that are using medicinal cannabis are driving anyway, and therefore when you introduce the exception that there's not more people driving? Or does it suggest that when you introduce the exception, the more people that are driving are taking some sort of advice or medical advice and then complying with it, and therefore not driving when they've got a higher amount of THC or an unacceptable amount?
I'm not sure. I mean, from my conversations with patients over the last couple of years and working quite closely with patients on a range of studies, my general sense is that people, if they feel impaired, they don't want to drive.
Yeah.
That's very common. If someone feels impaired, I mean, if you've got a 60-year-old with chronic pain and no history of cannabis use, and they start using medical cannabis, the last thing they want to do is drive if they feel that it's unsafe. So my sense is that people are pretty good at self-regulating. That, you know, the way that people do if you feel really tired, that you're going to switch drivers every 2 hours, for example, you pull over for a nap. The people, you know, don't want to put themselves in a position of danger. If we're talking about 20-year-old males who are already vastly overrepresented in crash statistics, that may be a slightly different story. But, you know, for most people that are using medical cannabis with a valid prescription, my sense is that they just simply don't want to drive. They think there's any risk, and they'll generally be quite conservative in their estimates. And often that's, you know, if they've used cannabis the evening before, they'll wait 8 hours or 10 hours until driving the next morning. If they've been using cannabis that day, they'll avoid getting in the car. For people living in regional and, you know, remote areas, I think that's a slightly more nuanced conversation, and that's difficult because driving's so essential to freedom of mobility and someone's quality of life. People then may make decisions to drive anyway because that's simply the only option they have. And then the question is, are they really likely to be impaired or not?
Yeah. So just lastly from me, I think the argument put in favour of the current regime of a criminal offence that criminalises mere presence of THC, basically, and then widespread availability of testing and enforcement. I think the argument put in favour of it is that in circumstances where you can't test for impairment in a very effective way, and in circumstances where there's no rule of thumb in terms of consumption and then the effect on impairment, that in those two circumstances it's necessary to send a message of general deterrence, I suppose, and enforcement to just deter people in an absolute and widespread way from driving after consuming cannabis, that's the only way to basically bring down the numbers in terms of adverse safety outcomes. What would you say to that argument?
I'm not sure. I mean, I'm not sure how your average medical cannabis patient responds to that general deterrence. I know that the University of Sunshine Coast have been doing some work on this, you know, generally looking at how people respond to that. I don't think I have a particularly good answer to that. I really think that this could be something that's better expressed as a conversation between a patient and their doctor. I'm not sure, you know, it's one or the other. I think bringing this back to the relationship between a patient and their doctor, and you know, a general kind of education program where people do feel empowered to self-regulate based on the information they have, rather than, you know, the general deterrence that's implied by roadside drug testing, could be equally effective. Doctors do this the whole time with patients who are using all kinds of other medications. I think we have a model in place. You say when there's no other, you know, I suppose sort of recourse for police instead of roadside drug testing. I'm not sure that's true. I mean, police can conduct impairment assessments. I know certainly in Victoria there's a drug impairment assessment protocol. Police can do it. The numbers around how many police are actually trained to do that and how often it happens are murky. I don't think they've released the numbers and how many of those tests have been done for quite a long time. But police do already have other, you know, I suppose methods at their disposal. They are time consuming. They're obviously a lot more complicated. You don't have the high throughput that you would have with roadside drug testing. So I appreciate that they're more difficult, but they're not impossible to do. And lots of other countries have a system like that in place already. So
I think maybe it's also, as well as not being able to be rolled out in the extent maybe necessary to achieve that objective, also perhaps not as accurate in the sense that, I mean, the saliva tests, I think, by and large, are accurate. If there's THC in your system at a certain level, it's going to pick it up. There might be some false positives or false negatives or whatever, but it's by and large accurate. Whereas that individual assessment that might come from an impairment test is going to miss a lot of people, I suspect, who might be on the tail end of affectation, for example.
Well, it would probably be used in a much more targeted way, and probably in conjunction with oral fluid screening. And I don't think that that's a bad route to go down, to have those two things together. That you use oral fluid screening really as a preliminary confirmatory. I don't know if that makes sense as a sentence, but you know, you would put, if there was evidence that someone was driving erratically, they'd be pulled over. An impairment assessment showed that you know, that there was grounds for that. That you then may use oral fluid testing as a way to say, okay, that's most likely due to cannabis. To me, that's actually quite a sensible use of the devices. So I think those two things could work in tandem, but that's appropriate for targeted traffic stops, not for random, you know, sort of mass roadside screening, obviously.
Thanks, Doctor. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you. The opposition.
I've only just one following on from that last question around the impairment. So you're saying that there are some accurate tests that are currently being done to measure impairment, or were you saying that there is the scope to do it?
I'm just saying that police already have at their disposal, I suppose, a toolkit that includes impairment assessments that could be used in that situation. Their accuracy is debatable. They're really based off, you know, a program that was introduced in the US quite a long time ago, and that they do work well for alcohol.
Yeah.
You know, the drug recognition experts in the short standardized field sobriety tests, they're pretty good for alcohol. They're not very good for cannabis. So I'm not in favour of saying let's go down that route and start rolling that out for everyone. I'm simply saying that you know, there are other options available at the moment that could be used in conjunction with oral fluid testing as a way to ascertain whether someone's, first of all, whether they were actually impaired or not, and if so, whether that was likely due to cannabis.
And in relation to your comments about, I suppose, self-regulation and making the decision as to whether or not to drive, you also commented about rural and regional, which makes it more difficult, and particularly challenges of transport and things. So how realistic would it be to actually say, leave this to individuals to make a decision when someone in a particular rural and regional area has no other option?
I mean, I don't think that would be the only message you send, is leave it up to everyone to decide for themselves. I think my point was that, you know, we generally trust people to make sensible decisions about when they shouldn't be driving the whole time. And that can be related to all kinds of factors, how well someone slept the night before. If you've run out of the house in the morning, you've just had an argument with your partner getting in the car. You know, there's all kinds of things that may affect your driving. We generally trust that people are going to, by and large, make sensible decisions about whether they can or can't drive. I don't think people do that, you know, especially well 100% of the time. And in terms of people driving in rural and regional areas, I'm not sure that is more complicated. I'd like to think that would be, you know, a part of what that looks like is that we give people a little more discretionary power to decide whether it's appropriate, but also that's a conversation with a doctor. I think if someone started on a new medication, a doctor should potentially have the right to say, okay, you're not allowed to drive for the first month, and you have a license suspension in place while we get you to a point where we know that you're not, you know, acutely intoxicated. So it'll be sort of part of a parcel where it's, you know, an ongoing conversation with a medical professional and a patient about what impairment looks like, how to recognise that, how long does it last, and then how to manage that appropriately.
My questions are around the equivalence of other prescription medications and impacts that they have. Like, we've heard evidence to say that cannabis use does impair driving ability to some extent, and that obviously varies according to how people use cannabis and how long ago they used it. Is there an equivalent medication in terms of the impairment, like, style or effect?
There's an equivalent in terms of the crash risk, you know, which is the likelihood of someone being involved in a crash should they have that in the system. I think the number that came out earlier was about 40%, which is consistent with some of the work that we've done. Antidepressants and antihistamines have a pretty similar crash risk associated with them. That's probably the closest we would get. And then 0.05 alcohol is a little bit higher. I mean, that's actually closer to a doubling in crash risk. So that's actually higher than the overall crash risk we tend to see with cannabis at the population level. Antidepressants, that effect's generally most pronounced in the very first sort of stages of treatment, and it does taper off. But antihistamines can certainly do this. I mean, common over-the-counter things like Phenergan, you know, promethazine, diphenhydramine, which is Benadryl, very common things that people might use for allergies or for short-term sedation do have a very similar crash risk to what we see with cannabis. And again, these numbers aren't perfect. You know, they're estimates based on studies that are often done in certain parts of the world. I don't know if Australia's ever done a really good study like this, but there are a couple of very instrumental ones in the US, you know, where you just have thousands and thousands of people who are randomly stopped at the roadside, and they say, hey, do you mind providing an oral fluid sample? And you compare essentially how many of those people are turning up positive versus the number of people who are involved in a crash turning up positive. And then you get an estimate of, are people overrepresented in crashes if they have THC in their system, or is there a similar number of people involved in crashes and not involved in crashes that have THC in their system?
Okay. So with antihistamines, for example, I mean, that comes as a surprise to me. I've never even considered that might be a problem. I personally don't have allergies, so I don't take them. But is there... Sorry? That was a dodgy prawn. That wasn't me. So is there, what kind of advice, medical advice do people get when they're receiving an antihistamine over the counter?
It's just a simple warning on the back that says, that I forget the exact wording, but this medication may make you drowsy or or something to that effect. I mean, I certainly know that I sometimes take something like Phenergan if I'm on a flight. Mm-hmm. You wake up feeling groggy the next morning. You're a little sort of slow and muddled, and that's where that crash risk comes in. They do make people feel a little sluggish and slower than they might normally be.
Okay. Yeah. And I mean, obviously you need a prescription for antidepressants. I presume that there is a clear conversation between a medical professional and a person who's been given a new medication in particular, as you said, to suggest that they shouldn't drive, or to let them know that there's an increased risk. There's no actual restriction available really at this point. Is that right?
As far as I'm aware, yeah. I mean, to be honest, I don't know how often that conversation happens. I would like to think that happens all the time, but I'm not aware of any research explicitly on how often that conversation happens with a doctor and their patient when they're starting a new medication that could impair their driving. I mean, probably opioids and benzodiazepines are a better example. Those often get trotted out in this conversation as examples of drugs that do and generally affect someone's driving, or they have a bigger crash risk associated with them than cannabis. I presume if someone was given a prescription for Valium and they'd never used it before, that would be a conversation the doctor would have, and it's probably don't drive until the next morning, and if you think you may be impaired, then avoid driving. But I don't know how often that happens or exactly what that looks like, but that's certainly something that doctors, I believe, are instructed to do, and there's sort of decision trees and frameworks in place to help them navigate, whether a patient either should or shouldn't be able to drive.
And are there roadside drug tests that capture antidepressants and antihistamines?
Antidepressants, I don't think so. Antihistamines, potentially. I mean, the one that the police use here is a very targeted one for a limited number of drugs, but there's plenty of roadside drug tests out there that screen for a whole host of things that are used quite commonly in the workplace, for example.
So not in New South Wales. In New South Wales, you wouldn't expect to have a random drug test on the side of the road and be picked up for antihistamines?
No. There probably are ones that are commercially available. I would have to take that notice and check that. But certainly for other drugs like ketamine, or there's sort of lots of other illicit drugs that these tests can commonly screen for. Antihistamines, I'll check that after.
Do you know if there are any legal substances that those roadside tests do test for? Or is it all illicit?
In terms of legal drugs?
Yeah, like something prescribed as opposed to...
Opioids are a very common one, yeah. It's quite common for those tests to test for opioids.
Okay.
Which could be a whole host of legally prescribed opioid medications or heroin.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Very helpful.
Thank you. Dr. Arkell, the Victorian government has commissioned a study by Swinburne into patients prescribed medicinal cannabis and to investigate possible impairment. You're oversighting that. Could you tell us a little bit about that study, without disclosing any confidential data, of course? But can you just tell us about how that's working, or just to inform our deliberations?
Yeah, so we've only just started. This is going to be a huge effort over the next little while for us. But essentially what we've done is we've got 2 research vehicles that have been articulated and kitted out with all kinds of tech for us to be able to measure at a very granular level how the driver is operating. So we have an array of cameras set up around these cars. We're getting information out of the CAN bus, out of everything about the engine state and whether the indicators are on, and speed in real time, braking force, basically everything you can imagine that you could possibly suck out of a car we're getting. And so we're going to have 72 patients divided into patients with chronic pain, anxiety or a sleep disorder, and they're going to almost attend a whole week of testing. So we'll be taking people down on a Monday afternoon to one of the test tracks, which is down near Torquay. It's about 2 hours southwest of Melbourne. And people will go through a whole day of testing there, where they'll get in the car before using their medical cannabis, and then at 2 different time points after they've consumed a standard dose or whatever their doctors prescribe them. They'll then stay over that night. We bring them back to Melbourne the next day, and then they attend another day on Friday at a different track, where we basically repeat the exact same protocol. And the 2 different tracks, one allows us to look at highway driving performance. So we have a 100 km/h speed limit highway circuit. It's a 4.2 kilometre circuit that sort of follows the land. It's out really in a national park, so it's quite remote. But it's fantastic because it's a 2-lane highway, and we can really accurately recreate, minus the complexity of the traffic, what highway driving looks like. And then the other one's more of a driving training facility, but it allows us to look at urban driving performance and more sort of fine motor skills, simple things like reversing and weaving through cones and tight cornering. So between those 2 tracks, what we're trying to do is get a sense of the different kinds of situations in which people may be driving, and really better understand whether there's any change in driving performance at all when we compare someone before to after they've used their prescribed cannabinoid medication. We're also essentially repeating that study but with alcohol. So we've got a sub-study on the side with 24 people, which is more of a randomized clinical trial where we'll have people at the same 2 tracks, exactly the same protocol. So we also have cognitive testing, we have blood sampling, we have oral fluid testing, we have a full-time nurse on site, we have all kinds of questionnaires. So we're collecting a ton of data for this. But then the alcohol study is a bit of a counterpoint. So we get people to around 0.05 BAC, so we get them to a threshold legal dose of alcohol, and we're then going to use that as a reference point for the results that we get with the patients, and say how does that data look like compared to someone that's just at that borderline legal blood alcohol limit.
Excellent. What's your view on there's of course an argument for a medical exemption or judicial discretion when it comes to medicinal cannabis patients. What's your view on essentially a cannabis only defence? That is, that someone cannot avail themselves of a defence if they've got a medicinal cannabis prescription if there's another, well, of course, illicit substance, but say a below 0.05 BAC. What's the relationship between, say, low-level alcohol use and medicinal cannabis? Do you think that that's a risk, and we should be focusing on defence for medicinal cannabis without any other sort of poly-drug use, or say, other than, say, caffeine, say, or nicotine?
It's a little murky, that combination of alcohol and cannabis relationship. If you use a lot of alcohol and a lot of cannabis at the same time, you shouldn't be driving. Simple as that. If you've got a BAC of 0.02 and you have a very low level of cannabis in your system, I don't think we really have good data on whether there's a cumulative effect there. I think in general I would probably be supportive of an alcohol limit for people that do have THC in the system if there was a medical defence available, which I also do support. I think that's probably not a bad route to go down. It's probably a system we should have in place for any prescription drug. That could, if you've got something in the system that could theoretically impair your driving, I think a zero BAC is probably not an unreasonable approach to pursue.
Excellent. The other question I have you done any, like, I suppose this is hard to do because we've only had medicinal cannabis available to patients legally for the last 7 or 8 years. What are the long-term, and we've talked a lot about the sort of short-term impacts of and effects of cannabis use, i.e. I've had cannabis, last night, and what's my driving like the next morning, or I've had it today, and what's my driving right now. What are the long-term impacts of, of cannabis use on motor skills and driving and these types of things? Is there a sort of cumulative effect over time that people's motor skills or cognition degrades? Is there any evidence of that?
It seems that people are using cannabis consistently in a fairly regulated manner, show very little sort of long-term or chronic effects associated with the use. If you're waking up and you're smoking 50 bongs a day, it wouldn't surprise me that 5 years down the track that person may have some cognitive deficits as a result of that. They do tend to recover after a period of abstinence. There was a Danish study that just came out very recently that looked at this, and this was I think they tracked people over about 40 odd years. I have to double check the numbers on that. But they compared people that had been using cannabis over that period with those that hadn't. And the people that had been using cannabis actually had a very mild, positive improvement in their IQ relative to the others. There was certainly no evidence of cognitive decline. Now, take that with a grain. And this was like a military sort of fitness to serve test. So I don't know exactly what goes into the test, but that was probably one of the newest bits of really quite comprehensive evidence with a very large sample to suggest that long-term cannabis use doesn't have any particular deleterious effects on someone's cognitive function. But again, the amount that you're using and the control you have over it, I think is important. In the same way that you may have a glass of wine every night with dinner. Over 40 years, is that going to affect you? It might make you a little bit less stressed, to be honest. If you're drinking 2 or 3 bottles of wine a day for 40 years, yeah, we're going to see a different outcome. So it's not, it's not that black and white, but it seems that people that are using cannabis, in a sort of consistent manner where their use isn't increasing over time and doesn't really fall into what we consider, heavy a sort of substance use disorder, that there isn't really any particular long-term effects.
We've heard a lot about changes in the US and Canada, and we've received evidence around that. What's the situation in Europe? Recently, Germany went legalised essentially home grow of cannabis. Did they change their driving laws?
Yeah, so Germany now has a 3.5 nanogram per mil THC limit, which is in blood serum. So in whole blood, that number would be a little bit lower, but they have introduced a level, a legal cutoff, and it's roughly consistent with the kinds of cutoff levels we're seeing in the US and Canada.
How do they test that? Is that after an accident? If you've had an accident and then your blood is above the 3.5 in terms of serum, then you've committed an offence.
Yeah, it's a per se offence. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
They do use one of the drug testing, the oral fluid testing devices, the one that police use here. The second one, the Draeger Drug Test 5000. They do have some oral fluid screening in place, but I'm not entirely sure, to what extent that's used in the field. I think the law mainly applies to. I think a positive test on that may be, grounds to require someone to provide a blood test, and then that 3.5 nanogram per mil limit would kick in as a legal cutoff. Yeah.
And are you aware of in these jurisdictions of sort of educative campaigns, like where there's been a legalisation push or a medical cannabis push, and there's been a corresponding roll out from like a relevant agency of an education campaign that says, okay, if you're smoking, or don't drive for 4 hours, or this is what responsible use and driving looks like. Are there programs or education campaigns you're aware of in that regard anywhere?
I couldn't answer that in any great detail. To the best of my knowledge, Germany is absolutely doing that. That was certainly part of their rationale, is that by doing this you can divert people away from the criminal justice system into the healthcare system, which is, I think, really one of the strongest, if not the strongest, reasons for regulatory reform, and one that we hear time and time again. So I can only assume that that's accompanied by a concerted effort to educate people around potential risks, but I don't know exactly what that looks like.
Okay. And the ACT, Canberra, has essentially decriminalised, legalised, I suppose it's this quasi legalisation system, homegrown cannabis. Are you aware of any data coming out of the ACT in terms of road safety, concerns about an increase in of road trauma associated with cannabis there? I mean, it's early days, but
I actually have a small grant from the ACT Road Safety Fund at the moment to look at exactly this. So I'm in the process of doing this right now. So I've got crash data from 2010 up through to the end of 2023, and I'm trying to see really whether there was any shift in road safety when comparing those before and after decriminalisation periods. I haven't finished analysing it yet. I'm waiting for police to come back to me with more of the actual drug and alcohol testing data. We have a full set of crash data, which is quite comprehensive, but we don't have complete drug and alcohol test results. Because, one question there is, are there more people testing positive for cannabis after? That's a very separate question from, has there been any change in road safety? From the preliminary analysis I've done, it doesn't look like there's any dramatic shift, but I would, be very sort of cautious to give you guys that as a takeaway. We'll have to wait and see until the final data set's analysed and we have the full set of results. And the only thing I would say is that, it's a very small jurisdiction, certainly much smaller than New South Wales or Queensland or Victoria, and so the number of crashes that actually happen are relatively low. And also the number of drug tests that are conducted. So I'm not sure whether that's going to be, completely representative of what a similar process might look like in other jurisdictions, but I will be able to come back to you with a more final and better response to that, probably in a few months' time, when that's actually been released and published.
We'd like to hear that. Colleagues, do you have any more questions? None from the government? None from the opposition? Well, thank you, Dr. Arkell, for taking the time and making the effort to come up to New South Wales to give evidence. We very much appreciate that and the work that you're doing in the community in this area. I think it's incredibly interesting and informative. So thank you very much again. I don't think there's been anything taken on notice, but if there has, the Secretariat will be in contact with you in due course. Once again, thank you very much for taking the time to come and discuss these issues with us and for the work you're doing. We very much appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.